Holly's Holiday, a novella written by CB Samet, narrated by Mandy Grant-Grierson. Chapter 1. Drex sat down on the park bench. African swallow or European swallow? Doesn't matter. A swallow cannot carry a coconut. The man beside him on the bench pushed his glasses up on his nose as he shifted his weight in the chair. Ludwig's English was good for never having lived outside the Czech Republic. I divided information, some on phone and some on USB, Ludwig said. Drex withdrew his phone and laid it on his thigh. The man did the same. As the data transferred, Ludwig dabbed a handkerchief to his forehead, despite the cool air around them. When do I get immunity? The information needs to be verified, and then the U.S. government will be in touch. You're not the U.S. government? Ludwig's voice raised an octave in surprise. I'm just the middleman. Drex kept his gaze scanning his surroundings. Letna Park was beautiful, despite the bare trees of November. A pale blue sky held wisps of white clouds. A breeze dropped the wind chill to around 40 degrees. Birds flocked near picnic tables in search of bits of crumbs on the ground. As nervous as the informant was, he didn't seem to notice his beautiful surroundings. I also have instructions about getting my family to safety. Ludwig withdrew a manila envelope. Drex glanced down at the data transfer between phones. 75% complete. I don't handle that part. Please, he pushed the envelope toward him. Drex's role was information transfer. If this informant was brokering a deal for immunity for himself or his family, then the CIA needed that information, not him. He wondered if the informant would hold back on the rest of the information if his terms weren't met. My job, Drex started to say gently, but a shot rang out and the informant's head snapped back. Sniper. Instinct kicked in, and Drex dove over the back of the bench. He sprinted for cover as pedestrians in the park screamed. His heart thudded, waiting for the second shot intended for him. It didn't come. Whether that was due to obstructing trees or an unwillingness to accidentally hit a civilian, he didn't know. The shot had probably originated from the Hanofsky Pavilion, since the iconic structure gave a panoramic view of the park from the peak. Drex didn't have time to investigate. Even as he ran and his mind calculated an escape route, he wondered who the shooter could be. Was it someone from the informant's government, the U.S. government, or a third party? And who had discovered their clandestine meeting? The only people who'd known were the two of them and the agency where Drex worked. 2 blocks from the shooting, he caught up with a crowd of tourists walking outside Kuzlo Museum. He slowed to join them, blending in for a few minutes and controlling his breathing so as not to draw attention to himself. He scanned his surroundings for anyone after him as he tugged a baseball cap out of his pocket and pulled it on. 2 men were on the hunt, necks snapping different directions as they searched. Humpty and Dumpty wore black cargo pants, black leather jackets, and intense scowling expressions. Drex didn't know them or who they worked for, but they were certainly trouble. When the crowd moved to enter the museum, Drex cut across Valdstenska Road and through a forecourt on the way to the metro station. As he continued underground, he pulled out his phone and speed-dialed a number. Chester, Code Brown, he said. Oh no! You about to be rolled up? Are you okay? The woman asked. Code Brown was their alert that they'd been played, literally when crap hit the fan. Some type of double cross was happening, and they needed to cut and run. Rolled up was spy code for discovered and captured. Hopefully he wouldn't be, but he'd never been so close to being ensnared before today. He felt like death itself was breathing down his neck. I'm working my exit strategy. I'm okay, but this is serious. Zelinsky? Chester asked. Sandra Chester, a feisty black woman in her 60s, had been Drex's assistant since he'd joined Zelinsky's team. All of the team worked remotely, so he'd only seen her the few times Zelinsky had wanted video conference calls, but they talked several times a week amidst the planning and execution of mission. Could be. Drex worked to slow his breathing as he rummaged through tickets. He'd pre-purchased one for the bus, one for the tram, and one for the subway. Only the three of us knew where the drop would be. He preferred to cultivate prospective informants himself and build the relationship before acquiring whatever secrets they had, but Drex had stepped into this delivery cold, never having met Ludwig before today. High-risk information exchanges like this were better done not in person, but apparently this defector wouldn't hear of it. Based on the bullet through his head, he hadn't made a wise decision. "You've got your arrangements?" Drex asked his handler after scanning his card and entering the boarding platform. Despite never meeting face to face, he'd bonded with her over the last 7 years. Forming attachments in his line of work created an occupational hazard, but he trusted Chester with his life. She'd helped him out of many tough spots and had an uncanny ability to forewarn of danger. "California will be lovely this time of year," she said. She wasn't moving to California, and he would never know her exact relocation spot. He hoped it would be somewhere tropical. Jamaica, perhaps. She deserved it. "You have any guidance for me?" he asked. "The spirits are telling me you should pick B." He'd never known what to make of Chester's claim to interact with spirits, but he thought of her gift as intuition rather than something otherworldly, and he wholeheartedly trusted Chester's intuition. It had saved him from more than one tight spot. Option B. He had 5 different identities ready for 5 different cities as contingency plans should something run afoul. While Chester had helped him set up the identities, she didn't know which letter corresponded to which location. In this way, she could never be forced to surrender information about his new life. Hopefully, she would arrive safely at the tropical paradise destination he envisioned for her and never have to contend with the fallout from this debacle. "Thank you for everything." He needed to wrap up the conversation before he lost his cell signal as he stepped onto the train. "Easy now," Chester said in a sweet, soothing tone. "This doesn't mean goodbye forever, just for a bit." "Oh yeah, your demons tell you that?" he teased. She gave him a cluck of disapproval. "Spirits, not demons." "Stay safe." He looked down at the envelope in his hand from the defector, Ludwig's dying request. "You enjoy your next adventure." She disconnected the call. Next adventure? All he planned to do was lay low and keep his head down. He had no way of knowing if the sniper was from his team, the Czech government, or the CIA. All of these groups would now be after him, either because they wanted the information he now had, or because they thought Drex was the traitor. Holly pulled her office door shut and locked it. She adjusted the hanging green and red wreath. Delightfully warm with Christmas spirit, she barely noticed the biting cold wind. After adjusting her hat and scarf, she practically skipped down the sidewalk. Tonight was the night. Tonight, Figgy would appear, and for the next 12 days, the two of them would spread Christmas cheer. She walked the few blocks home, grateful the sidewalk had been cleared. Her exterior Christmas lights blinked white, green, and red. She decorated her front door to look like a slender, gift-wrapped present. Too bad the inside of her house wasn't as picturesque as the outside, or at least the outside night view, since daylight revealed peeling paint and tattered shingles. After unlocking the door, she let herself inside and dropped her keys and purse in the foyer. To the left, her Christmas tree twinkled in the unfinished living room. To her right, the kitchen smelled of paint sealant. At least she had heat. She'd purchased the older home as a foreclosure. The foundation was in good condition, but everything else was outdated, from the dark wood paneling in the living room to the bland kitchen cabinets to the faded wallpaper in the bathrooms. Nothing a little TLC couldn't fix, except that the project seemed never-ending. When she wasn't busy buying and selling homes for her clients, she poured blood, sweat, and tears into her own. Yes, all 3 of those ingredients from her body had gone into this house. She hung up her coat in the closet and walked toward the living room fireplace. Could she get the flue working in time to enjoy a fire this Christmas? Lifting the peppermint-scented candle from the mantel, she inhaled the fragrance. She would forever be instantly filled with happiness and fond memories at the smell of peppermint. After setting it back down, She used the lighter beside it to set the wick to flame. December 12th. She would let the candle burn tonight, and tomorrow Figgy McJingles would arrive. Victor Selinsky bit off the end of his cigar and spit it into the trash can. After lighting it, he leaned back in his chair and puffed. He didn't like loose ends, and Drex Allister was a loose end. The operation was supposed to flow smoothly. Once the check made the exchange, he died, then Drex died. His men had been instructed to then remove all sensitive information from the informant and the spy. Instead, Drex ran, and they'd been forced to chase him, hoping to apprehend him as a traitor. He'd escaped, with the envelope. "Victor, are you still there?" "I'm here," he grumbled. "What are you going to do about Allister?" Donna repeated. As the Associate Deputy Director for Intelligence, she was only a few positions below the Deputy Director of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. Zelinsky took a long, slow drag on his cigar and blew out smoke. "He's out of my organization. What more did they want? He was a burned spy who would go into hiding, already had by all accounts. You saw the video. They made the exchange, and then Allister had his sniper take out the defector. Zelinsky had paid one of his own to record the encounter. He'd watched the video first in case it needed doctoring, but it hadn't. Events were clear. The exchange took place as the Czech, Ludwig, passed off the manila envelope, and then he was shot." "They didn't make the exchange," Donna said. "What?" Zelinsky sat up straighter. "I'm not sure what was in the manila envelope, but Ludwig still had possession of the jump drive when Czech authorities found him. We were able to confiscate it from police evidence." Zelinsky's mind raced with how to spin this. Drex must have thought the information was in the envelope and gave the kill signal. What was in the envelope? We don't know. "Are you going after Drex Allister?" he asked. "We need answers." He cursed silently. That was a yes. And if they captured Drex, could Zelinsky's involvement in the hit come to light? Drex couldn't possibly have any proof, but the cunning ex-spy could try to find evidence in the time it took the CIA to close in on him. And he probably had Sandra Chester on his side. His savvy handler had disappeared at the same time Drex was burned, a telltale sign of where her true loyalty resided. "There is another conundrum," Donna said. He grimaced and reached for his drawer. Antacid or bourbon? They were side by side in his desk. Based on the familiar burning in his gut, he reached for the antacid. "What's the conundrum?" he asked casually, keeping his voice even. "Allister helped Ludwig's family out of the country." "To where?" "We don't know. They've vanished as well. What traitor takes the time and risk to move his informant's family?" "It was probably his best way out of the country. You and the Czech government are hunting one man, and he escapes by posing as the husband and father to the family sneaking out with him." Perhaps. He hadn't convinced Donna because his argument was thin. Drex would be faster and more mobile without someone's family to look after. Why had he done that? Guilty conscience that he'd somehow been responsible for Ludwig's death? "Be careful," Zelinsky warned. "Drex Allister is the deadliest contract spy I've ever trained," he lied. He hadn't trained him, and he had no idea if Drex was deadly. His operatives possessed a range of cultivated skills, but they were in the business of information exchange, not murder or assassination. If someone died by their hand, it would more than likely be self-defense. As far as Zelinsky knew, Drex had never killed anyone. The CIA didn't need to know that. "We'll proceed with caution," Donna assured him. So will I, Zelinsky thought. He took a swig of bourbon to chase down the chalky taste of the antacid. He suspected that if Drex discovered the CIA was after him, he would want to clear his name rather than go to ground like a well-behaved dog. He couldn't risk Drex digging up Zelinsky's buried bones of evidence and the money trail proving he'd been paid to eliminate Ludwig. Chapter 2. Holly woke at 5 a.m. and tossed her covers aside. After standing and stretching, she adjusted her Christmas tree print cotton pajamas. Today would be glorious. "Figgy?" When she didn't receive a reply, she dressed quickly, pulling on blue jeans and a long-sleeved shirt with a sequined candy cane on the front. She bounded down the stairs, careful to avoid the loose board, fourth from the bottom, and not grab the insecure railing. The stairs were one of many items on her house repair to-do list. Figgy! She went to the kitchen, but didn't see him there. In the living room near the tree, she spotted him scrutinizing her decorative efforts. He was about 4 feet tall, but hovered a foot off the ground. He had a full head of wavy brown hair, punctuated on either side by plastic pointy elf ears. His outfit was classic commercial elf apparel: green vest over a red shirt with flared collar, red leggings, green pointed shoes, and green and red striped hat with a golden bell on the end. The most startling part of his appearance was the way his whole body shimmered with semi-transparency. "Merry Christmas," she said. He turned around at her words and smiled at her. "They're burning on the mantel. You remembered to light the candle." His face was young, maybe 8 or 10 years old, with rosy cheeks. Despite his appearance, he acted much older. "Of course," she returned the smile. "'Tis the season." She'd bought the magical peppermint candle at an estate auction 3 years ago. The instructions pasted to the bottom advised lighting the candle December 12th and letting it burn past midnight. On a whim, she'd done so and woke to find the ghost in her house. He'd been dressed to look like an elf then as well. She'd initially panicked, blew out the candle, and ran outside of her apartment of the time. When she'd returned home, he was still there. She'd visited the local family doctor, Charles Akers, and had him run tests under the auspices she was experiencing concerning headaches. Blood work and brain imaging had been unrevealing. No brain tumor, no electrolyte abnormalities, no hormonal imbalances. After accumulating those medical bills, she'd underwent sessions with Candy, now Candy Akers, the town counselor. Stress relief sessions hadn't made the elf disappear. Despondent, Holly had returned to her apartment and addressed the ghost directly. "Why are you here?" "To bring Christmas cheer." "What are you?" He'd looked down at his attire and back up at her. Gesturing to his outfit, he'd said, "You need more of a clue?" "You look like an elf, but you also look like a ghost." He beamed. "I am both. To spread joy, I am your host." "Do you always rhyme?" "Would you prefer I mime?" He extended his arms and flattened his palms before moving them up and down as if against an invisible wall. Holly had laughed. Whatever this creature was, he clearly posed no threat to her. After that, they'd exchanged introductions, and he explained he would be visible only to her. "Whomsoever lighteth the candle shall take command of my handle," until December 25th. She was allowed his services for that duration to embark on any activity that would spread joy and cheer. "What delights await?" Figgy's words brought her back to the present and her work-in-progress home. "New couples to create?" "I have a few ideas." She gave a mischievous grin. "What of your fate?" "Me? I'm happiest when I'm bringing people together." Last year, they had paired the Akers together through careful planning. Figgy had a knack for knowing when and where people would be around town. His uncanny ability, paired with Holly's intuition about what people liked and who they may be compatible with, made them a dynamite duo in connecting future couples. Figgy said, "But your blonde hair glows in the sunlight, and your blue eyes are ocean bright." She put her hands on her hips. "Flattery? What's gotten into you? You could find your man. We only need to plan." He blinked big brown eyes at her. Holly frowned. Her Christmas elf had never been this persistent about her own love life. She'd trusted a man once. She wasn't ready to do so again. Playing matchmaking for others was satisfying enough, and she had the added insight of Figgy's supernatural abilities to know the couples they paired would be safe together. Such knowledge hadn't been available to her during her own relationship. Drex let himself into his new house. He'd never been a homeowner, but if he was going to blend into small-town USA, he needed a cozy 4-bedroom house like this. The walls were bare, but the essential furniture was present. Kitchen table, living room sofa, bed and dresser in the master, refrigerator, washer-dryer, and treadmill. He set his briefcase and house keys on the kitchen table beside a gift basket of chocolate, nuts, and fruit. He read the note. "Congratulations on your new home. Thanks for using Holly Realtors. Yours truly, Holly Sanders." Drex scowled. His first order of business would be to get her to drop the key she had in his mailbox. He couldn't have a realtor coming and going as she pleased. His mobile phone rang. "Hello, Chester." The incoming number was unregistered, but she was the only person who knew his new phone number. "How's your new home?" He shook his head in disbelief. Of course she knew he'd arrived today. "Nice. I managed to do 90% of the search and purchase remotely." Fortunately, he'd never had to meet this Holly Sanders face to face. She was entirely too enthusiastic about her job and asked too many questions. He'd found the house online and made an offer electronically. Instead of immediately accepting the offer as the representing realtor, Holly Sanders had requested a phone call to discuss the purchase. She'd been more interested in making sure the house was the right fit rather than making fast money. "Do you have kids?" she'd asked. "Is that relevant?" "Of course it is." Her voice was a fountain of cheer. "You want to be in the right public school district." "No kids." "What about physical activity?" "Excuse me?" "There's a gym near the house you picked out, but I know a subdivision closer to biking and trails and another near a golf course." He frowned. "No golf. The house I picked will be fine." "Where will you be working? Let's make sure the traffic patterns are favorable for your commute." "Blitzen is a small town. I'm not worried about traffic patterns. I want this house." How was he to get her to stop probing? Perhaps the prospect of more money. "And I'd like to pay your company to add basic furniture and appliances." "Do you want me to send some color schemes and designs you might like?" No. The thought of looking at color palettes had him rubbing his temple. "Just keep it functional. No frills." "No frills. Got it. Will you be needing lawn equipment too?" Lawn. He would be a homeowner and a lawn owner. The image of himself pushing a mower seemed serenely domestic. After a hot day of yard work, he could relax on the porch with a cold beer. But lawn mowing days wouldn't arrive until the spring, and he would first have to survive until then. "No lawn equipment," he'd answered Holly, "but I would like a treadmill." Drex spotted the treadmill in one of the spare bedrooms as he pulled his attention back to the conversation with Chester. "How is your new place?" he asked her. "Sunny and warm." He snorted. That probably meant she'd moved to Alaska. "Did you give yourself an equally ridiculous alias?" He'd been stupefied after the incident in Letna Park when he pulled out his new passport and driver's license only to discover his name was Chris Holliday. "You like it?" "I'm surprised you didn't just pull out all the stops and make my last name Kringle." "Did you know I'd be embarking this identity in December?" He wasn't going to also tell her the name of the town he now lived in was the same as one of Santa's reindeer. Chris Holliday moved to a town named Blitzen in December and had purchased his house from a woman named Holly. Ridiculous. "Could be a spirit told me." Her tone was filled with amusement. "Could be you're mocking me." "I would never," Chester said, her voice dripping with honey. "Look, Chester." He sat in his recliner and leaned back. "I'm grateful for all of your help, going all the way back to when we started together. I hate that our friendship burned you." "You're good people, Drex. I knew that from the first case I assisted you on." "Oh, yeah?" "You were neck deep in the new Irish Republican Army trying to turn Finnegan. He wasn't budging, even as you learned about the bombs placed around Waterloo and Heathrow. You had a choice to make: out your cover and stop the immediate threat, or let a few civilians die from the bombs, but stop thousands of deaths later by staying under cover and learning all the players and their hideouts. You managed to stop the bombs and turn Finnegan." Drex's mouth went dry and his head spun. "How did you know about the bombs?" He'd written in his report that Finnegan had stopped the bombs, hoping to grease the wheels for better treatment of him by the British government as they learned his secrets. Only he and Finnegan knew Drex had sequentially deactivated the bombs after he'd restrained Finnegan. It had taken giving Finnegan an ultimatum to turn him, go willingly and cooperate, or the government would likely force the information from him. Drex's cover ended with that, but he'd accomplished his mission. I've told you before, the spirits speak to me. Anyway, after that mission, my loyalty lay with you. I knew you'd always find a way to do the right thing and not sacrifice others for personal gain. Now, she continued, why don't you take your new town and your new name as a sign that you need to enjoy the month? Soak in the season in whatever city you landed in and immerse in the Christmas spirit. Christmas is for suckers, he grumbled, only half joking. Besides, he had work to do in order to figure out how to clear his name. Although he had a new home and new identity, he wasn't under the misconception he was safe. It was only a matter of time before either Zelensky or the CIA caught up to him. Chester let out a harumph. Hogwash. Just because you never had a family to show you the meaning of Christmas doesn't mean it's without significance. Keep an open mind and an open heart, and you might be surprised what's possible. I don't have time for distractions, but if it means that much to you, I wish you a Merry Christmas. It's a start. When Holly walked into the kitchen to make breakfast, Figgy followed. She filled her blender with ice and added almond milk and powdered kale protein mix. I was thinking about a few of our bachelorettes. There's Hope, the interior decorator, Linda, the dentist, and Regina at the bakery. As for our bachelors, we have Rick the lawyer and Chance. He runs the town's Meals on Wheels company. Figgy cocked his head to one side. Someone's new this holiday. Someone's come from far away. Holly blended her breakfast as she considered the elf's rhyme. Someone new from far away. Oh, she poured the green mixture into a tall glass. I sold a house last month to someone new, Chris Holliday. He was not very personable over the phone, especially for someone with that name. I've no idea what he looks like or if a relationship with one of these women is possible. He's Regina's age, though, mid-30s, so there's potential. She runs the bakery with her mom, Janet. She tapped a finger on her chin as she considered the match. She didn't have enough information on Mr. Holliday. After a long drink of her shake, she said, I need to meet him. I need to size him up and see if he's worthy. She's super sweet, which might melt his icy first impression. I can drop by as his realtor and welcome him to the town. Go to the bistro at 10. You'll meet your mystery man again. Again? She headed back upstairs to her bedroom, shake in hand, as she calculated the time she could take to exercise and work a bit on the house before going to the bistro. I haven't actually met him yet. We've only talked over the phone. Mystery Man was right, and she would learn more about him, and she would learn more about him and see if she and Figgy could work their matchmaking magic. Chapter 3. Drex drove to the grocery store and found a parking spot near the cart repository. Last night, he'd snacked out of the basket his realtor had left for him as he reviewed everything he knew about Ludwig's case, but now he needed real sustenance. After grabbing a cart, he headed inside and worked his way aisle by aisle since he wasn't familiar with the layout. He loaded his cart with cleaning supplies, laundry detergent, brooms, and a mop. As he scanned the shelves, he thought of how he'd have to take into consideration things like air filter sizes and light bulb wattage. He tried to gauge how he felt about domestication. He could certainly manage it for a few months. He may even enjoy it. He'd already decided that if he survived long enough to clear his reputation, he wouldn't go back into the spy business. The lies and deception were tolerable until it cost a man his life. And the prospect that the guilty party might have originated from Drex's organization only further soured his taste for the business. But could he follow his dreams? He added canned soups to his cart as he pulled out a worn postcard from his pocket. He'd bought it at a convenience store in San Francisco, but the where wasn't important. The what mattered. The photo was a picturesque bookstore front, though a little large. Through the window display, he could see crumpled shelves of colorful books under soft golden light. He tucked the picture back in his pocket. He'd imagined something similar, except in small-town America with large window storefronts under colorful eaves.
"They're not ripe yet."
Drex's attention snapped back to the present, where he stood in the produce section, avocado in hand. He assessed the man before him who'd spoken. Early 60s, barrel-chested, white hair, and a slight curve of his lips that offered the possibility of friendliness, unless it was a ruse to lull someone into a false sense of security. No gun and no place to conceal one in his jeans and flannel shirt. Threat level was to be determined. The white-bearded man picked up an avocado.
"They'll need a few more days. You'll know they're ripe when they're a darker color and a bit softer."
Drex filled a bag with 3 of them. Thanks for the advice. The man wasn't wearing a name tag or store apron, so why was he dishing out advice about perishables?
"Are you visiting for the holidays or settling in?"
He reached up and stroked his white beard. Drex's mind honed tighter at the way this man had scrutinized his cart, his appearance, and the absence of a wedding ring. He'd assessed Drex the way Drex assessed everyone. He was probing for Drex's intentions. Then he realized he knew this face. Drex had done his research online about the small town, and this man was the town's sheriff. His appearance looked different owing to the long beard he currently sported, whereas his online photo was smooth skin on his square jaw. Drex weighed his options in a millisecond. He was seen with a cart of cleaning supplies no visiting tourist would be purchasing. His usual reply, if a stranger interacted with him, was to keep the interaction punctual and move along. Safer for everyone, because someone watching might mistake the bystander as a person of significance to Drex. Plus, he rarely stayed in a city for more than a few days, unless he was building rapport with an informant to acquire secrets, so there weren't repercussions for being unfriendly to strangers. In this town, though, he needed to blend in, which would require him to be congenial, especially to law enforcement. "Settling in," Drex replied, plastering a friendly smile on his face.
"Tough time of year to move. Starting new during the most social season of the year?"
"Yeah," he gave a light chuckle. "I'll have some adjusting to do." A brunette walked past, pushing her cart and waving. "Hi, Sheriff Carpenter." Drex's jaw clamped as he tried to maintain the smile, his suspicion confirmed. The first person he met in his new life was the town sheriff? Unbelievable. The sheriff extended a hand.
"Joe Carpenter."
"Chris Holliday." He shook the meaty hand, but noted the grip wasn't unfriendly.
"Ah, you took the new house off Pine Street."
"That's the one." He beamed to cover his dismay at the town sheriff knowing exactly where he lived.
"Welcome to Blitzen."
"Thank you." Drex picked up a head of lettuce.
"If you're looking to meet some townsfolk, there is a Christmas dance on the 20th and a big food drive with the parade on December 21st.
"Thank you, Sheriff. I'll keep those in mind." Holly drove downtown and parked on Main Street near the bistro. "Isn't it gorgeous?" she asked Figgy, who hovered in the passenger seat beside her. Now that he was here, she had someone with whom to enjoy the decorations. "A lovely display of Christmas cheer, a harbinger of fortune this coming year." Snow topped the eaves and lined the sidewalks. Each street lantern bore a giant shimmering golden snowflake. During the day, the tinsel sparkled, and at night, the lights glowed. Green wreaths with vibrant red poinsettias and berries adorned storefront doors near windows framed in Christmas lights. Holly zipped up her winter coat, pulled on her gloves, and tugged her hat over her head. "Are you coming or staying?" "I'll watch you from afar. I'll stay here in the car. If you need me, say the word. I'll fly to you like a bird." Based on their past encounters, She knew Figgy often kept his distance when she entered crowds. Since she was the only person who could see and hear him, and she didn't want to be the strange woman talking to herself, she was content to update him on events later. Somehow, though, he was also able to watch her without her seeing him. She hopped out of the car and walked to the bistro, where she held the door open for Mrs. Whittaker. "Holly, how are you?" "I'm great. Are you planning Christmas with Patrick and Penelope?" "Oh, yes, a big get-together since Manny is the first grandchild in the family." Patrick and Penelope were a couple Holly and Figgy had paired 2 years ago. She worked at the bank, and he was a veterinarian. Together, they had 3 dogs and child number 1. "How about you, Holly?" Although she suspected Mrs. Whittaker was asking about family, she opted to skirt the question. "I'll be at the Christmas dance. Hope to see you there." As the women exchanged Merry Christmases, they went different directions inside the bistro. Warm air engulfed Holly as she walked toward the counter. She wasn't hungry, so she ordered tea and took a seat. Glancing around the shop, she saw mostly townspeople she knew, the retired Jones brothers who spent their afternoon playing chess at the rec center, the town councilor, Candy Akers, and Sheriff Joe Carpenter, who was growing his beard out again to play Santa at the parade. Others were tourists, not fulfilling the demographic of the man she sought to have a chance encounter with, Chris Holliday. She realized her poor planning as she scanned the room a second time. She didn't know what this mystery man looked like, and Figgy wasn't close by to point him out. She pulled out her phone and elected to do a search. Ugh, there were too many Chris Hollidays, and although she knew he was a consultant, she didn't know his company's name. She might have to summon Figgy to point him out to her. All thoughts of the newcomer vanished when Holly caught sight of the profile of a handsome man at the checkout counter. He had brown hair and dark brown eyes. His oval face held a strong jaw with trim facial hair and straight nose. "Drex?" she said tentatively, but the slight tensing of his shoulders told her that her instincts were spot on. She stood and gave a friendly smile. "Drex Allister?" He hesitated, as if debating if he would acknowledge her. When he lifted his head her direction, she smiled. He greeted her smile with a tentative quirk of his lips, not unfriendly, but carrying a hint of irritation to suggest she'd interrupted or intruded, perhaps his lunch break. He was dressed in jeans, a gray sweater, and a faux fur-lined black coat. "Do I know you?" he asked. She walked closer, suddenly embarrassed by her outburst. Of course he wouldn't remember her. She had been a freshman crushing on a senior who barely knew she existed. Drex stared at the vibrant blonde woman approaching him. Blue jeans hugged slender legs, and a candy cane t-shirt gave her a festive look. She gave a more tentative smile as she turned her paper cup in her hands. "Not really. We went to the same high school." "High school?" Of all things. First the sheriff, and now someone from high school identified him in remote Maryland? "James Madison High?" She looked like she really wanted him to remember her, but he didn't. High school had been 3 different schools and 3 different foster homes. He didn't remember much of anyone from his 9 months of senior year in Brooklyn. He did, however, recognize this woman from the pictures he'd seen of her realtor business. He glanced around the room, noting that the 2 of them were drawing the attention of patrons. She waved a hand. "You don't remember. It's okay. Never mind. I'm sorry I bothered you." A flush creeping up from her neck threatened to reach and merge with a pair of reddening cheeks. He'd rather see her beaming smile on that lovely face framed in blonde curls than the way she retreated into a shell of insecurity. "Not a bother at all," he said. "High school was a long time ago. Maybe you can jog my memory." When her smile returned in full force, the bistro became suddenly warm and cramped. "Do you want to walk and talk?" He gestured toward the door. "I always prefer walking to sitting," she replied, in a chipper voice. She set down her drink long enough to zip her coat and put on her gloves and hat. Drex found himself smiling. Apparently, hers was contagious. He opened the door and was grateful for the blast of cold air that struck him. Surely he'd been warm because she'd identified him, and not because she was an attractive woman close to his age. He had no time for a relationship, and certainly no intention of endangering someone by proximity. "James Madison High. You came in new and no one knew you," she said. Story of my life, he thought. She continued, "You didn't have a Brooklyn accent. You kind of had this aloof vibe, like you were too cool for school." Drex laughed, startling Holly. "I don't know about cool. I mostly wanted to keep my head down and graduate." They walked side by side down the sidewalk lined with storefronts. "How did you end up in this town?" Drex asked. "Fresh start 3 years ago. I visited this place once with my family, and the beauty of it stuck with me." A fresh start? He could relate to that, but he wondered what had been important for Holly to leave behind. He shook off the thought. No attachments. He might not be here long enough to form anything meaningful. Blitzen is a magnificent little town, he agreed. Main Street was picture perfect. Despite his many drops and exchanges in big cities and the blissful anonymity a metropolis offered, small shops in a central, cozy town captured his affection. "How did you end up here?" she asked. "Fresh start." "What do you do?" she asked. "Consulting. And you are in real estate." "How did you know?" "Your poster is on the billboard on the drive into town. Holly Sanders." "Oh, right." He would have to also come clean about his alter ego. In a small town like this, she was bound to run into people who referred to him as Chris Holliday, such as Sheriff Carpenter. If he didn't get in front of the lie, it would only arouse suspicion. "As the superstar town realtor, perhaps you can give me the tour," he suggested. Who better than to give him the inside scoop on everything he needed to know? That 1,000-watt smile of hers sent a zing through him, which he instantly squelched. No attachments. Chapter 4. Drex walked arm in arm with Holly down the center of town. "Let's start with Main Street," she began. "For shops, there's Mila's Boutique, Charity's Charm, Ackar's Jewelers, Toy World, Tony's Wine Bar, Blitzen Antiques, and more." She continued to rattle off places and the names of owners. "There are 38 buildings on the National Historic Register. Upcoming events include Classical Christmas, which is a dinner and candlelight concert at the Montgomery Museum, sponsored by the Blitzen Heritage Foundation. Every second Friday is live music and sidewalk sales downtown, when it's not freezing. Oh," she pointed to 2 white horses in a carriage, "and carriage rides. Crime is 40% lower than the U.S. average. We are only 15 miles from the Ocean City Boardwalk." You're a regular encyclopedia. With a memory like that, maybe she should have been a spy. He suspected she'd committed all of this to memory for her job in real estate. "Let's go in the bakery." She steered him across the street. "Janet and her daughter Regina are phenomenal bakers. Chocolate eclairs to die for. One taste and you'll want to be best friends, or more." She's single. At her last statement, she gave him a sheepish grin. When he didn't follow her inside, she let the door close and returned to his side. "Everything okay?" "Look, Holly, if he went inside, she would introduce him as Drex. But he wanted to spread the name Chris Holliday as much as possible. There would still be damage control from her calling him Drex at the bistro, but the more people who came to know him as Chris, the better." "I'm sorry," she grimaced. "I shouldn't have made the single comment. It's just that I have this compulsion to matchmake during the holiday season. I noticed you don't have a ring and I overstepped." She took a step as if to start walking away from the bakery, and her footing gave way ever so slightly. The motion was too minuscule to even call it a slip. Still, he linked his arm through hers, not willing to risk her repeating the motion and slipping. He kept his bistro box lunch in the other. Drex led her down the sidewalk. "Don't fret about it, but I definitely don't require your matchmaking services. I have no problem being single for the holidays. I have been all my life." He'd spent time with women in a romantic capacity, but nothing long enough to be called a relationship. Part of him hoped parading Holly on his arm down Main Street would deter all other women from approaching him. "That's depressing," she said. He chuckled. The reason I appeared as the new kid in high school and seemed aloof was because I was in and out of foster homes. Christmas was usually an outside looking in event. Eventually, I realized I didn't really need holidays. He wasn't sure why he opened up to Holly. Perhaps because she'd somehow remembered him after all these years. He'd never considered himself worth remembering. Everybody needs holidays. What about you? He asked. I love the holidays. So, do you stay in Blitzen or visit home for Christmas? He wondered if home was back in Brooklyn or if she'd been a transplant too. She chucked her empty cup in a trash can. I am home. He ran a tongue along his teeth. He suspected the terse reply, masked with forced cheer, was related to the fresh start she'd mentioned. A story lurked behind that fresh start, but he didn't need to know it. Are you celebrating with someone? But he knew the answer. She was obviously not engaged or married. She'd been alone at the bistro. She hadn't pulled away when he'd linked arms, and she wasn't worried about public opinion of being seen arm in arm with a man. I celebrate by bringing people together. Whoa, would you look at that? Drex stopped and gaped at a bookstore. The exterior was navy with gold trim. Twinkling lights framed the large windows. The inside display was a glowing scene of miniature people reading books in a winter wonderland of wreaths, Christmas trees, and snow. Before he knew what he was doing, he pulled out the postcard. Holly leaned toward him. It's a similar style, isn't it? Where did you get that photograph from? When he entered the store, she followed. This one is just a dream. He waved the postcard in the air before tucking it back in his pocket. This one is real. His gaze roamed around the shop. The smell of books filled his nostrils, paperback and hardback, new and vintage. A faint scent of cinnamon also hung in the air. I've dreamed of owning a bookstore like this on a street like this. But I want a bigger room for a coffee bar, some tables, and a couch. He clamped his mouth shut and glanced at Holly. He'd never shared his bookstore dream with anyone, not even Chester. Holly's eyes sparkled while she looked around as though visualizing the dream with him. Feeling oddly exposed, he exited the shop. Just a dream. As if sensing his discomfort, she looped her arm back through his. It's a beautiful dream. Everyone has to have dreams, and maybe someone to share them with. He suppressed an admiring chuckle at her innuendo. As a spy, he knew how to plant the seeds of ideas to reap later. She was good, but he wouldn't let his appreciation of her talent show. He didn't want to encourage her. They reached the end of the lane, and he took her toward Pine Street. I would appreciate if you didn't add me to your matchmaking efforts, he reiterated. Are you sure? I know several eligible women your age. Maybe you just need a little more time to settle. Her voice held a teasing tone. Settle. That was as fanciful a notion as becoming a bookstore owner. Holly's mind had raced with the prospect of connecting Drex with one of the eligible women in Blitzen, but he'd effectively squashed those plans. No problem. She had other people to skillfully weave together. She could circle back around to him later. Perhaps Drex needed a different type of Christmas miracle. She wondered if she could help him achieve his bookstore dream. She realized they'd walked several blocks from Main Street as she let her scheming plan marinate. He stopped in front of a 4-bedroom house with white siding and blue window trims. She knew this house. This is my new house, Drex announced. She frowned. No, I sold this to someone else. Yes, you sold it to my nom de plume, Chris Holliday. Why do you have a pseudonym? I thought you did consulting. Even as she said the word, she realized she didn't know what that meant exactly. She'd never asked him to elaborate on his career. He pulled his arm away, turned and faced her. Like you, I needed a fresh start. His gaze met hers in something close to a dare. She started to open her mouth to ask what he meant, but thought better of it. Asking him why he needed a fresh start would pave the way to him asking her, and she didn't need to rehash the misery. Do you like the house? She asked. It's perfect. Seems big for one person. I like my space. I guess so after growing up in foster care. He seemed to consider her analysis and accept it. Perhaps you're right. What about the furniture? Was it to your liking? She'd been happy to sell the house, but had also coveted it for some time. It was walking distance to Main Street, and she'd dreamed of having a location like this near town. The home was also new, and not the fixer-upper in which she'd invested. You did great, he said. His sincere compliments sent a wave of heat through her. Oh. She was standing very close to a single man whose house she intimately knew. Bedroom sizes, furniture, bathroom layouts, and kitchen appliances. She swallowed and took a step back from him. Drex looked puzzled by her distancing. I appreciate everything you did, and I'm sorry for having to work with you remotely for the purchase. No problem. Do I call you Chris or Drex? She asked. I like Drex so much better, but if you could use Chris in public, I would appreciate it. She threaded her gloved fingers together. In public. When would they be in private? Was he assuming there would be a private moment? They stood on the sidewalk, just the two of them, in a winter wonderland. Was this one of those private moments, or was this public? When had the December air become so thick? She eased another step back from him. Chris. Yes, got it. And I got your gift basket. Oh, good. A thoughtful touch, he added. Can I walk you back into town? You're home, and I have errands to run. She continued to walk backward. Are you okay? I feel like I've made you uncomfortable with the name thing. She shook her head. No, the name is fine. She rapped knuckles against her head as she continued to back away. I've got it locked in my vault of a memory. He chuckled. Then I know my secret is safe with you. Holly walked back to her car in a daze. Chris Holliday was none other than Drex Allister, whom she'd briefly crushed on in high school. What were the odds? Now, Figgy's statement about meeting him again made sense. She rubbed her inner elbow where her arm had been linked with Drex's. The closeness had been unexpected, especially as they were essentially strangers. He'd rejoined arms after she'd had a slight misstep on an icy patch. She hadn't been close to falling, and the timing wasn't as though he was catching her. He'd been a gentleman, without implying he thought she couldn't walk on her own. He offered a safety net without judgment. He seemed genuinely pleased when she'd appreciated his offer. You're such a klutz, Holly. The voice from her past rang in her ears. Unlike the man she'd left behind, her exchange with Drex hadn't felt the least bit derogatory. She straightened and brushed strands of hair off her cheek. She needed to focus on the initial task. Drex Allister was Chris Holliday, and the man was desperately in need of some Christmas cheer. True, he believed he didn't want to meet someone this holiday, but everyone says such nonsense when faced with the potential of someone matchmaking. What Drex didn't understand was that she and Figgy worked covertly, and their efforts would feel nothing as awkward as a blind date. She weighed her options. Regina at the bakery, Linda the dentist, or Hope the interior decorator. When she reached her car, she unlocked the door and sat in the driver's seat. Figgy appeared beside her. Well, I met Chris Holliday. Her gaze slid to the ghost and then back to the wheel as she started the car. I saw the exchange entirely, and you're not thinking clearly, Figgy said. Of course I am. We're going to make this holiday great. You were watching us? Did you hear the part about the bookstore? The other day at the bistro, I heard Pickens talking about maybe selling the place. I can look into that more. The adjacent shop is for sale. If Drex bought both, he could knock out the wall and have his bookstore with his coffee shop combined. But that might be a little too much space. Well, I suppose you just fill the space with more bookshelves. Drex might be your toughest case. Take care, and you must make haste. Holly drove them back to her place. I specialize in haste, quality, and speed. Holly, slow down and stop being a spaz. You get so sloppy sometimes. She shook off the criticizing voice in her head. So, what is your holiday mojo telling you? She asked Figgy as she forced a smile. She listed off the names of prospective women for Drex. The elf was silent moments before narrowing his eyes at her in a calculating look. To succeed in our endeavor, two he must meet, but that Drex is clever, will need to be discreet. Discreet and hasty? I am up for a challenge. She pulled into her driveway and shot a disparaging look at her house. She was up for a challenge, was she? She had certainly given herself a challenge when she bought this house. On the bright side, she had all afternoon to sand the floors and conspire with Figgy. Zielinski stopped his online day trading to take a phone call. It's Donna. Has there been a development? Zielinski asked the CIA officer. He debated if he should prophylactically take an antacid any time she called, and he opened his drawer just in case. Yeah, we got a flag on Drex Allister. Sheriff in a town in Maryland was looking up the name in a few databases. Zielinski bit back the urge to swear as he tightened his left hand into a ball. 3 weeks had passed and he'd had no news of Drex's whereabouts. He'd hoped that meant the ex-spy had slunk into a hidey hole for good, but successfully disappearing in the electronic era wasn't easy. That's great news, he forced the words out of his mouth, glad Donna couldn't see his expression. I hope you catch him. He tarnished my company's good name. What did the sheriff say? He opened the bottle and tossed 2 chalky tablets into his mouth. We didn't want to alarm him that the CIA would be visiting his little town of Blitzen. Hopefully, we can quietly send our man in and deal with Drex without alerting any local authorities. Reasonable plan. Thanks for keeping me in the loop. Who are you sending, if I may ask? Spinner. A smile spread across Zielinski's lips. Stan Spinner. Excellent. The CIA was sending a known assassin. The man didn't miss and had a reputation for being quick and clean. Drex would never know what hit him. Donna hung up the phone, and Zielinski stared at it with dubious delight. He would be relieved when the CIA dealt with Drex, and he wouldn't have to continue to look over his shoulder. Ever since the Prague debacle, he'd felt like his reflux was slowly transforming into an erosive ulcer as acid burned through the lining. He looked at the date on his computer, December 15th. His problem would be handled in the next few days and would feel like an early Christmas present. Chapter 5. Puzzling on Holly's strange behavior, Drex let himself into his house. He'd enjoyed walking with her and immersing in her bubbly personality. She had beautiful hair and true blue eyes, earnest, honest blue. He'd never met a woman like her, all genuine warmth and smiles. But some of that behavior was a brave front. For what, he wasn't sure. None of his business. After shrugging off his coat, he peeled off his black tactical shooting gloves. He'd worn them for warmth, but they were also the only gloves he ever wore. The thin material meant he could fit his hand into the trigger hole to fire a gun, and yet they still kept his fingers warm. He washed his hands before taking his bistro sandwich to the table and sitting down. As he ate, he perused his secure email on his laptop. Nothing from any of his contacts. He'd done favors over the years for defectors and other spies, but now that he was burned, he might never be able to cash in on those. Yet he would check messages regularly in the event someone felt obligated to warn him if his new identity was compromised, or had the urge to pass on any information about Ludwig's death that might exonerate Drex. But he couldn't count on that definitely happening. He used his burner phone and called Chester. You're supposed to be enjoying your new home, Chester said in lieu of a hello. Hard to enjoy anything when you feel like there's a target on your back, he said. Try to relax, she said. You haven't heard anything? Nobody knows where you are. Was she saying that based on intuition or just the absence of knowledge? And if she was out of the business like he was, what connections did she still have? Let's hope I can keep it that way. So far, local law enforcement has introduced himself and I was recognized by someone from my high school. He had registered his gun to carry it concealed, which could raise alarms if law enforcement did an inquiry on his new identity. If Sheriff Carpenter discovered the licensed weapon, he might be prompted to dig into Chris Holliday's past. When he didn't find much, he might dive deeper for answers and wouldn't like what he would find. A high school buddy? Chester asked. I didn't have high school buddies. This is a woman, the local town realtor. Were you a heartbreaker in high school? He scowled into the phone. Impossible. I didn't date anyone in high school. I was a loner. No friends, no girls. Chester grunted. Seems not much has changed. This woman remembered you 15 years later. You must have made some kind of impression. Maybe it's a sign you need to stop being a loner. He logged into his laptop and did a quick search of his alma mater. A relationship in the midst of my situation would be irresponsible. Someone could get hurt. Besides, I think she's the type of person who remembers everybody. Some type of cataloging brain, which is why she's successful in sales. He went back 15 years and found evidence of Holly Sanders having attended his high school. She was who she claimed to be and had remembered him accurately. Uh-huh, Chester said. He roughly closed his laptop. Look, I didn't call to talk about relationships. What had gotten into Chester anyway? Can you just keep an ear to the ground so you can give me a heads up if you hear about trouble coming my way? Always. Thanks, Chester. And I'm sorry for being the cause of your early retirement. If she hadn't been protecting him, she might have been able to stay under Zelinsky, unless Zelinsky was behind Prague, as Drex suspected, in which case he'd done Chester a favor and kept her from being Zelinsky's next pawn. It was time, she said simply. When he hung up the phone, he fidgeted with his watch and withdrew the small USB hidden within it. He still had Ludwig's information, though the file he'd downloaded to his phone was encrypted. Drex had transferred the information onto a USB, but he didn't have access to the type of software needed to unlock it. Plus, he already knew from Ludwig that this was only partial information, and he didn't know who now possessed the other piece. He wanted to finish the job and turn what he did have over to the U.S. government, but he wasn't sure who he could trust. With his burned status, friends might now be enemies, and who knew what lies Zelinsky might be spreading. He twirled the USB in his fingers, resigned to waiting. Most of spy work was patience and building relationships. He would have to bide his time and wait for an opening. If Chester learned anything, she'd let him know. Unlike the movies, he didn't muscle his way into saving the day, and there was certainly no dashing through the snow or chasing down leads with the clock ticking. Well, except for the bomb in Amsterdam, but that had been an isolated incident. Holly sat in the bistro across from Linda, whom she'd convinced to join her on a lunch date. 3 days had passed since running into Drex at this very place. So much for haste. But Holly had gotten bogged down in work, and this was the next best chance encounter she and Figgy had concocted. Do you have Christmas plans? Holly asked Linda. I'll close up shop on the 23rd and drive to upstate New York to see my brother. Linda had short chestnut hair and the perfectly white teeth people expected of their dentist. Holly nodded, a little disappointed Linda hadn't said she'd be here alone for Christmas. That would have been a better opening for discussing Drex, Chris. How about you? Linda asked. Here alone, Holly chewed her lip. How about the Christmas dance? Are you going? Do you have a date? Linda swallowed a bite of her Philly cheesesteak sandwich. Holly couldn't help but think she'd need extra mouth mints before going back to work after consuming those onions. With those vibrant teeth, she probably brushed after every meal. No date. Who has time for that? Linda sipped her Diet Coke. You can make time. I date. You should see my collection of romance novels. That's not dating. Dating is companionship. Holly toyed with the straw in her drink. I happen to think I don't need a man to complete me. Everyone needs companionship, and it can be for fulfillment, not because of some notion that you're incomplete. So how come I don't see you chasing a man? Linda fired back at her with a playfully accusing tone. Okay, first of all, chasing a man is not dating. It's just wrong that you associate the two that way. Secondly, it's taken 3 years to build my self-esteem back after the last man. Thirdly, I'm in the contemplative stage. Linda blinked at her. There are detailed stages? Of course, just like buying a house or any change in life. Pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, and action. She ticked them off one finger at a time. Then I guess I'm in contemplation too. The doorbell jingled as Drex entered the bistro. Giddy excitement bubbled through Holly. Figgy had predicted Drex would come here for lunch, and now Holly's plan was falling into place. When he saw her, they exchanged waves before he stood in line to place his order. Linda glanced over her shoulder. Oh, are you sure you're not in the action stage? Holly gave a nervous chuckle. She couldn't tell Linda she was immersed in the action stage of helping other people. He's a friend, but I'll see if he can join us. Her plan was to have Drex join them for lunch, and then Holly would spontaneously remember she needed to meet with a client about a house. With a wrapped sandwich in hand, Drex approached their table. Holly had suspected, gentleman that he was, that he would come say hello, even though he'd gotten his food to go and would have left otherwise. "Hi, how's your day?" she asked. "Good, thanks. I got your message about the bookstore. I'm going to stop by there tomorrow." She turned toward Linda. "This is Linda Gilbert. She's a dentist here in town." "Chris Holliday. Nice to meet you." His smile sent warmth through Holly. Maybe this would work. Linda's pager buzzed. "Oh, that's me. I need to go." She scrambled to wrap her sandwich in the paper around it and stuffed it in her oversized purse. Holly stood as she stood. "You have to go?" "Duty calls." "You wear a pager?" Drex mused. "Dentists, doctors, and drug dealers. We're the last group clinging to old technology, but it works." Shocked at the turn of events, Holly watched Linda leave the bakery. Figgy had been wrong about the timing of events here. Figgy was never wrong. "Do you want some company?" Drex asked. She tried to compose herself. Yes, that would be great." He took a seat and unwrapped his Italian sub. Holly sat back down, recovering her composure. "Linda is a fantastic person. She normally doesn't vanish like that. Must have been an oral emergency. She's a career woman but has weekends off. She has a boat in Ocean City and goes sailing during the summer." Drex had lifted his sandwich toward his mouth, where it hovered as he listened to her. Unbitten, he set his sandwich back down. "You're not very subtle about your ongoing attempts at matchmaking." She lifted one shoulder and didn't attempt to conceal the guilty look she knew she wore. "I'm not a subtle person." He chuckled. "I'm still not interested." She stuck out her bottom lip in a pout as she contemplated her next move. She didn't want to pursue a topic that would detract from his enjoyment of his lunch break. "Okay." She snatched a pen out of her purse and unfolded a clean paper napkin. "Let's talk about that bookstore." He gave her an adorable grin and took a bite of his sub. She wondered if she could still soften him up to the idea of spending Christmas with a special someone. She drew as she spoke. "This rectangle is the bookstore. The rows of shelves are tight together. If you expanded it to include the unoccupied shop next door, you'd get this." She extended the rectangle to a larger square. "The cafe could go here with seating here and little tables beside them for drinks. Hope, she's an interior decorator, could probably suggest some unique mood lighting for the sitting area." She cleared her throat and looked up, worried she'd gotten carried away. "Depending on your budget." The dreamy look in his eyes as he stared at her sketch suggested he could picture her description. "It's brilliant. The lights should be golden and strung low from the ceiling. The sitting area should be earthen tones for warm comfort." "You've thought about this." "I've been in a lot of bookstores. But yes, I'll also have to look into my budget." They continued the conversation about bookstores and places Drex had traveled as they ate their sandwiches. When they finished, Drex stood. "Thanks for the company. I enjoyed lunch with you." He folded the napkin with the floor plan and put it in his pocket. "Yes, me too." She pulled on her coat, hat, and gloves. "Oh, I did want to ask you if I can get my other spare key back from you." He shrugged into his coat. Absolutely. I have other work this afternoon. I can come tomorrow. Bring it to your place. Sounds good. Drex left the bistro and crossed the street. He looked back to see Holly getting into her car. When he looked up and noticed he was in front of the bakery, he thought he'd try those eclairs Holly had raved about while also doing a little reconnaissance. He needed to know more about the town and more about its gregarious realtor. How much of a security threat to him did Holly pose? When he pulled open the door, the bells on a festive wreath jingled. It seemed every shop in this town had jingle bells. The bakery smelled like cinnamon, vanilla, and chocolate. A woman in her mid-50s stood behind the counter, drying her hands. "Can I help you?" Her voice was cheerful. "Yes, I'd like a chocolate eclair." He withdrew his wallet. "Just one?" "It's half off the second." She pointed to the prices on a large chalkboard on the back wall. "Twist my arm. I'll take two." "Also, we're taking orders now for Christmas cakes and pies. We'll reach capacity soon, so you'll want to place your order now." "I won't need any of those, thanks." "Going back home for the holidays?" "I am home. I moved into the new house on Pine Street. Chris Holiday." Her smile brightened. "Oh, Holly mentioned a newcomer." She turned her head. "Regina, order up front," she called toward the back room. A woman emerged from the back wearing an apron and her raven dark hair pulled back. She had her mother's oval face and round nose. "I'm Janet, and this is my daughter, Regina. Regina, Chris just moved to town." When the baker smiled at her daughter, a mischievous glint in her eye told Drex that Holly wasn't the only person who might threaten to try to set him up in a relationship. "Nice to meet you. I moved in on Pine Street, bought it from Holly. She recommended this bakery." Janet busied herself boxing two eclairs. "I'll be sure to thank her," Regina said, subtly fluttering long eyelashes. "Have you been friends long?" he asked. "Since she moved here about 3 years ago. She's a fantastic realtor, even picked out furniture for me. Is she seeing anyone?" The corners of Regina's mouth fell slightly. Drex knew she would infer that he was romantically interested in Holly. Although he wasn't, feigning interest in her to others would ward off unwanted advances. Yes, he could take this angle. And since Holly had retreated from him awkwardly the first day they'd met and tried to set him up with the town dentist, she clearly wasn't interested in a relationship. As such, he wasn't in danger of hurting her feelings, and she might never know. "No," Regina shook her head. "I haven't seen Holly with anyone, and if she was dating someone, this place is one of the first places she'd bring a man." He puzzled on that a moment, since the bakery had been the first place Holly had tried to take him. Janet rang up his order, and he paid in cash. "Do you think I'm her type?" He gave a winning smile as he walked toward the door. "I honestly don't know," Regina said. "I don't think she's dated anyone since moving here." "Oh," Drex faltered. He'd intended on slipping out the door and congratulating himself on achieving his deception, but genuine concern stopped him in his tracks. "Why is that?" This was a small town, but Holly must have some dating options. Regina's expression softened at the concern in his voice. She opened her mouth, but her mother shooed her away. "Those cakes aren't going to cook themselves." Regina cast an apologetic look toward Drex as she returned to the back room. Janet busied herself straightening pastries. He guessed that concluded the conversation. "Nice meeting you. Thanks for the eclairs." As he exited the bakery, the cold bit into his cheeks and ears. He scanned the premises, the hair on his neck raising slightly, but he didn't see anyone watching him. He saw some familiar and some unfamiliar faces as people moved along Main Street and in and out of stores. Townspeople and tourists traveling at different paces, but all preparing for the holiday. But some had a few shifty behaviors he was learning more about each time he ventured into town. The bank president flirted a bit too much with the diner waitress 20 years younger than him. The grocery store stock boy played with a butane lighter on his breaks. Drex didn't know how to walk through life without observing everything and everyone around him. Walking home, he considered this new insight into Holly. She'd claimed she'd moved here for a fresh start, and he'd wondered if she'd run away from some part of her past. Now he contemplated if she'd never made that fresh start and was still living under the shadow of her past. Nope, not going there. He absolutely did not want to delve into Holly's past or present. No attachments. He walked home and dropped the eclairs on the counter, but hadn't satisfied his urge for information gathering. He got in his car and explored the outer limits of the town, including a drive by Holly's real estate office and her home. She lived in an older home in need of a paint job. When he glimpsed the back porch and noticed crooked and missing planks, he wondered about the safety of the place. Was she struggling to make ends meet, or did she want the challenge of a fixer-upper? Why did he want to know? He pictured her leaning over the napkin, putting thought and energy into his bookstore idea, investing time in him. He was fascinated by her interest in others and wanted to learn what made her tick. He snuffed the idea as he drove home. No attachments. Chapter 6. Holly stopped at the bakery to pick up eclairs. She had texted Drex to let him know she would deliver the requested spare key to him. She decided to concurrently bring some of Regina's cooking to him. Perhaps once he tasted the divinity of her dessert, he would be receptive to becoming acquainted with her when the opportunity presented itself. "Morning, Regina. 2 eclairs, please." "Holly, good to see you. How is the house coming along?" She tugged off one of her gloves and held up her hands for Regina to see the blisters and Band-Aids. "It might be the death of me. Death by 1,000 cuts. That or the roof will cave in. Or the back porch," she thought. But she never ventured out onto the hazard since the first time she felt the instability beneath her feet. "You should hire Winston to help with that." "I might. But if she paid for every repair the house needed, she'd go broke." Holly decided to change the subject. "So, there's a new guy in town." She wiggled her eyebrows and leaned closer as she lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Cute and single." "Chris Holliday. We met." Regina rung up her order. "You did?" Holly straightened, then brightened. "You did," she repeated. Maybe they'd already struck a chord together. "I did. And boy, is he interested in you." "Me?" Holly fumbled with her credit card before inserting it into the reader. "Yeah, asked if you were seeing anyone." "Oh." This wasn't going according to plan. Drex was supposed to be interested in Regina. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe he hadn't tasted whatever he'd ordered yet, and therefore couldn't yet fall for Regina's special superpower, delicious sweets. And why would he ask Regina about her? She hadn't flirted with him, and she'd been very clear that the matchmaking was with someone else. Had she sent him mixed signals? "Holly?" She jumped. "Yes?" Regina looked down at the electronic reader. "You can take your card out." "Oh, right." Holly pulled it out, put it in her purse, and took the packaged eclairs. She thanked Regina and tugged her glove back on before she left. She started walking toward Drex's house. "Figgy?" He appeared beside her, the bell on his hat jingling. "Did you hear that? Drex was asking about me. What should I do?" "You haven't a clue?" "No, that's why I'm asking you." Oh, now I'm rhyming. "If sparks aren't flying, those plans are dying." "Okay, not Regina. How about Linda? I'm trying to get her to go to the Christmas dance. She always comes. Can I hook them up there?" "Perhaps, but you'll need to prepare." She reached Drex's house and stepped onto his porch. "What does that mean? Prepare what?" But Figgy vanished as Drex swung his door open. Wow, she hadn't even knocked yet. Had he installed some type of door sensor? "Holly, thanks for coming." "Your spare key." She held it up. "And eclairs." "Thank you, although I did take your advice and try them already." As he took the bag, she made an obvious show of trying to peer around him at the inside of his house. "Yes, Regina told me you two met." She grinned. Before he could open his mouth, probably in some form of objection to her trying to match him, she said, "Your house is still bare. You haven't unpacked yet?" He arched an eyebrow, as if to convey his displeasure at her intrusiveness. She shivered and bounced on the balls of her toes. He deflated slightly as he stepped aside and gestured to his foyer. "Would you like to come inside?" His tone suggested he'd asked out of politeness, but didn't actually want company. Holly's smile widened. Oh, he was not into her. Regina must have misread their interaction at her bakery. She stepped inside the glorious warmth with renewed determination at her matchmaking scheme. After slipping off her boots, she walked around the living room and into the kitchen, where Drex began putting each eclair on a plate. She tugged off her knit hat and patted her hair down. "You haven't done anything yet. No decorations, no furniture except the stuff I bought you." He poured 2 glasses of water before sliding a glass and an eclair over to her. "What's the rush?" "No rush." She picked at the edge of the pastry as she leaned on the counter. "But most people have a few personal effects they put out right away. You don't even have boxes lining the walls to unpack." He stood on the opposite side of the jutting countertop and took a bite of eclair as he stared at her. "Oh, have they not delivered your belongings?" She wondered if the snow had delayed his shipment. He swallowed a gulp of water. "What you see is what you get. A fresh start." The same challenge lit his eyes as the other day, as if she was supposed to let the topic of conversation die there, and she wouldn't like the repercussions of digging. She understood the discussion would be tit for tat. She'd have to be willing to explain her fresh start if he was going to share his. Standing in his kitchen, eating his dessert, and watching him move in those blue jeans made diving into that conversation easier than she'd expected. "I didn't bring much with me when I made my fresh start," she said. He crossed his arms, but his voice was deep and gentle. "Why is that?" "I ran away on my wedding day." He blinked as his mouth opened in surprise. "Ran away?" She continued to pick at the dessert without taking another bite. "It was a scene straight out of Runaway Bride. I started down the aisle and then bolted." "Why did you run?" "Fear." She slowly turned the plate on the counter. The church had gorgeous stained glass windows filtering golden light. The aisle was lined with white lilies and pink ribbon. It was a beautiful sunny day, and I had a sudden, cold, chest-squeezing realization that he was Mr. Wrong, or at least the willingness to finally admit it. "And you came here." "Haven't been home since." She turned her water glass in slow circles. "So you made a mistake, or you avoided making one. Why would you not go home?" "Everyone is fuming mad at me. They're upset with how I treated Harry." "And you haven't dated since. 3 years?" She narrowed her eyes at him. "How do you know that?" He shrugged. "Regina told me." "Regina, right. Holly was here on a mission, which did not include divulging her past, no matter how compassionate Drex's brown eyes turned." She straightened. "Thank you for the eclair." "You bought it." "You shared." "Anyway, I also wanted to make sure you knew about the Christmas dance on the 20th. Lots of people will be there with live music and local beer." "Are you asking me out on a date?" She let out a nervous chuckle. "What? No, that was not my intention." Warmth crept from her neck up into her cheeks. She had been so masterful at her other matchmaking efforts over the years with Figgy. How was she repeatedly failing with Drex? When he took a few steps closer, only a thin strip of counter separated them. "You were just being friendly." She tugged at her scarf, trying to loosen it so she could breathe. "Yes, I wanted to help you make Blitzen a home. Help you mingle and settle." Her eyes darted to the front door, calculating the shortest distance to escape. "Are you this thoughtful to all your clients?" he asked. "I like to think so." Perhaps she was friendlier with Drex because of the high school connection only she remembered. But truthfully, she knew nothing about this man aside from good manners and good looks. "I should go," she swallowed. "Holly," his voice sounded gentle. "If you want to leave, leave. I won't stop you. But please, don't be afraid of me. You look like I frightened you, and I'd like to fix that. I'm sorry I accused you of asking me on a date." Frightened? She wasn't afraid of Drex. Not like she had been of Harry. "It's fine," she shrugged. He remained so still, and his face was so calm that she thought perhaps the safest place in the world was right at his side, perhaps even directly in his arms. On an exhale, she relaxed. "I'm not afraid of you. I have nervous energy sometimes." "Your leg is bouncing again, Holly. Knock it off. Why haven't you started taking the anxiety pills your doctor prescribed for you?" "Anyway," she cleared her throat, I hope you'll consider going to the party. She walked past Drex and toward the door. He reached it before her and opened it. Will you be there? Yes. Then so will I. She bit back a smile. Okay, see you there. A block away, Holly's lightheadedness began to clear. Figgy appeared beside her as she walked toward her car parked outside the bakery. She opened her door and climbed in the driver's seat. That did not go as planned. He is going to the dance. That means there is a chance. Chance for what? He thought I was asking him on a date. She started the car and drove home. At the Christmas dance, you could give him a chance. Her gaze snapped to Figgy and then back to the road. You little devil. You knew Drex had already talked to Regina. Did you know he would take my mention of the dance as a personal invitation? The elf ghost blinked rapidly, but didn't answer. She pulled into her drive and let the car idle. Figgy, she implored, my life is a mess, and I told you about Harry. 3 years you've been away from home, 3 years, and you're still alone. Drex needs you. You are the glue. 2 fresh starts this Christmas season. His life saved. You'll be the reason. Saved from what, she wondered. Loneliness, she presumed, judging by his house. She killed the engine inside. For once, I wish you didn't speak in riddles. Zielinski parked his car at the motel as he cursed the weather. His drive to Blitzen had been initially delayed and then followed by agonizingly slow travel through the snow. Thanks to the holiday season, the closest place for room and board was an hour drive away from Drex Allister's hideout town. 4 days the CIA had known about Drex's location, and still Zielinski had received no word that his former employee had been eliminated. He didn't want to call Donna and ask. That would appear too desperate and tip them off that Zielinski considered Drex a loose end. He wanted to give the CIA the impression the loop was closed. He'd only received half his payment since the CIA had only retrieved partial information from the USB taken off Ludwig after his death. And Drex's reputation had been irrevocably damaged. End of story. Except Drex was still alive, and the ex-spy might try to clear his name. Zielinski wanted this small-town operation to be a quick, easy in and out, but eliminating the burned spy would require a little planning, stealth, and creativity. The problem was that he didn't know exactly where Drex was staying. He knew the town sheriff had looked up information on Drex, and the electronic search had triggered the CIA's internet filter for the spy's name. But the ex-spy wasn't staying in this one-horse town under his real name. Zielinski had checked. Since Zielinski didn't know his target's new identity, or if he even still looked like the Drex that Zielinski had known, finding the former spy would require several days. And if he'd been savvy enough to hide under an alias not in the company's files, how had Drex slipped and let the sheriff know his real name? Was he getting sloppy in his early retirement, or was he laying a trap? Fortunately, Blitzen wasn't a bustling metropolis. Zielinski only needed to stake out the few most likely places everyone in the town traveled: the diner, the gas station, and the grocery store. After checking in and getting his room key, Zielinski pulled the suitcase out of his car. He'd only brought one weapon, his faithful Sig Sauer. There wasn't any large buildings he could perch from for shooting a high-powered rifle, and he sure as heck wasn't about to sit in a tree in freezing weather waiting for his prey to pass his line of sight. Those days of his youth were long gone. The situation was irksome, because the safest way to deal with a man like Drex Allister would be a 500-yard kill shot with a rifle, as had been the plan in Letna Park, and not under 50 yards with a handgun. A handgun meant Zielinski would need to get up close and personal with the ex-spy, who would have to be stationary long enough for him to fire. Yes, one more reason his attack would need to be calculated in order to succeed. Zielinski carried his suitcase over the packed snow and ice as his footing threatened to slip several times. At last he made it to the door, still standing, but the card took multiple swipes before it finally worked. Once inside the room, he slammed the door shut. Even inside the motel room, his breath condensed on the frigid air. He cranked on the room heater, which began to rattle absurdly loud and emit fumes of burning dust. The familiar, dull, burning ache in his stomach radiated up to his center chest. These accommodations were beneath him. A few days of staying in these conditions, and he'd be more than ready to shoot someone. Chapter 7. Drex threw Holly's partially nibbled eclair in the trash and cleaned his kitchen as he thought about his strange encounter with the woman. Another strange encounter. So why did he enjoy them so much? She'd seemed genuinely sad at his lack of personal touch around the house. He'd never attached himself to places and objects, as these things weren't necessary for survival and didn't define who or what he was. As a realtor, she seemed to think a house defined a person. What did that say about her and her house in disrepair? She hadn't been treated well, and it seemed her emotions were in parallel disrepair to her home. She had a good heart, but busied herself thinking about others' wants and needs and not her own. Who was Mr. Wrong, and why hadn't Holly moved on since him? What memories or events still haunted her? Why had she suddenly been afraid of Drex? Afraid of him, or afraid of liking him? The woman who liked to matchmake avoided romantic entanglements herself. Did that make his plan to put on an appearance of interest in her a great idea or a terrible idea? If she was protecting her emotions, and he accidentally lowered her walls, could he hurt her? Would he be the next Mr. Wrong? He did not want to hurt Holly. He needed a new plan. He saw two options. First, bow out of the dance while distancing himself from Holly. She would take the hint. He barked out a laugh at that thought, startling himself. No, she wouldn't take the hint. With a smile, he thought about how she'd nosed her way right into his house, and he clearly allowed her to plow through him, maybe even enjoyed it. Option 2 was to go to the dance and let Holly work her matchmaking magic. He could meet and politely dismiss whomever she attempted to set him up with. This could be weeks of exhaustive efforts on his part, but Holly would have the satisfaction of trying before coming to the realization that no one could manage his romantic life. Yes, the long game was the way to play this. It wouldn't be too different from his spy work, which often took planning and patience. Holly donned her red dress for the dance while swaying around the room and singing Silver Bells. She'd had a productive 3 days with selling a house and working on her own, including getting the flue working for her fireplace. Throughout that time, she counted the hours to the dance. She tried to tell herself her excitement stemmed from the social event itself, but she also understood that when Drex agreed to attend because she would be there, something in the little protective bubble she'd constructed around herself had shifted. She enjoyed his company and the way he was receptive to her energy and ideas. Was she moving from the contemplative stage to the planning stage after all? Was she ready for a relationship? She wouldn't get ahead of herself. Tonight was only a dance. Figgy appeared in her room. She brushed her hair one last time. "Are you congratulating yourself? Your schemes to make me like Drex worked. When you have a friend so dear, you want to brighten her sphere." She touched her hand to her heart. "You're incredibly sweet. You have brightened my sphere. And you're a dear friend, too. If you weren't a ghost, I'd hug you. But," she waggled a finger at him, "I'm not getting my hopes up. The man said he does not want a relationship, and there will be other women at the dance. He has eyes only for you. You softened his heart, but there's more to do. I promise to be open to the idea of a relationship if Drex expresses interest. That's all I will agree to." Figgy crossed his eyes and smiled, rosy round cheeks bulging. The Christmas party was held at the rec center off Main Street. Holly parked her car and scurried into the building, hoping the salted walkway had been de-iced enough for her high heels. After checking her coat inside the front door, she entered the dance hall and marveled at the decorations. Golden snowflakes hung from the ceiling, and a 12-foot-tall tree glowed brilliantly behind the band. Even though she'd been here every year for the last 3 years, it still held magic and wonder. She lifted a glass of champagne off the serving tray and made the rounds to speak with everyone. "Holly, how is the house coming?" She grinned at Winston, a big burly handyman who'd helped her with repairs on several houses she'd put on the market. It's a work in progress. Call me and we'll get her patched up. Thanks. Holly, good to see you, Janet said, looking lovely in a festive red and white dress. Your pies will be ready for pickup the 23rd. Excellent, thank you. Holly had purchased pecan pies for all of her clients this year and had plans to pick them up and deliver all of them that day. Regina, you look fabulous, Holly said. The baker smiled as she swished her green dress. I clean up all right, but I love the red on you. She leaned closer. All decked out for Mr. Holiday? Holly could have argued that she'd planned to wear this dress before Drex even came to town, but she didn't think acting defensive would curb Regina's teasing. He's here, you know, Regina said, and he wore a tux, an actual tuxedo. Holly looked through the crowd, trying to spot him. Good luck, Regina elbowed her. You're going to have to battle half the single women in Blitzen if you want that man. Holly chuckled. Perhaps he would find someone, and her matchmaking this holiday would conclude with her own emotions unscathed. So why did she feel the slightest pang of jealousy that Drex might dance with another woman tonight? Figgy was clearly turning her brain into pudding with all his talk of her finding love. Sheriff Carpenter approached, wearing brown slacks and a red and green plaid shirt. Holly, pleasure to see you. Sheriff? She gave him a quick peck on his cheek just above his white beard. You know, Janet is here stag tonight, Holly winked. He looked over his shoulder at the woman. You should ask her to dance, Joe, Holly encouraged. He smiled. I might do that, but I also came over to ask you a favor. He led her to a less crowded spot. My elf is sick. I'm wondering if you could fill in tomorrow. I'm sorry for the short notice. The parade and the kids. She thought about the consequences of no Santa's elf. Organizing children for visitation wouldn't happen, and chaos would ensue, making a magical occasion a nightmare for kids and parents. That was if Sheriff Carpenter wasn't forced to cancel the Santa visitation event entirely, which was volunteer-run anyway. Can you help with both? The parade is just waving, but Santa's photo event is substantially more involved. I need you to keep the line of kids moving. I can help. Text me the details later. You're a lifesaver, Holly. She caught a glimpse of Drex in his tuxedo, talking to Regina. He looked stunning in black and white, holding a champagne flute. The sheriff followed her gaze and then stepped into her line of sight. You be careful with that one. She frowned, looking up at him. What do you mean? I heard you call him Drex Allister in the bistro the other day, so I did a little background check on Chris Holiday, who doesn't exist. And Drex Allister is almost as much of a ghost. I'm not surprised. I knew Drex in high school briefly. He was in and out of foster homes. Well, aside from a degree in foreign affairs, he has very little electronic footprint. Holly's lips quirked. You don't trust him because he's lacking social media presence? Even his consulting business is questionable. Just be careful. We don't know much about him. When the sheriff walked away, he made a beeline for Janet. With satisfaction, Holly watched him ask her to dance. You look amazing. Warm breath caressed her neck. She spun around to see Drex standing behind her. You came, she smiled. I said I would. He plucked the drink from her hand and set the two glasses aside. I like your tux. Do you? It seems I'm a little overdressed for the occasion. He took her hands and led her to the dance floor. But next to you and your dress, perhaps the tux fits. What are we doing? He started to sway with her in his arms. She felt evanescent in his embrace as she danced with him. I've been waiting a half hour for a break and you're socializing. If I'm going to get time to myself, there's no better place than the dance floor. She smiled at the thought that he was too much of a gentleman to interrupt her as she talked to friends and townspeople. For Pete's sake, Holly, will you shut up already so we can go home? You never stop talking to people. She shrugged off the memory, determined to let nothing detract from this moment. Drex held Holly in his arms as they floated on the dance floor. He'd barely sipped his champagne, and yet his head buzzed with the magic of Christmas and dancing with a beautiful woman. He'd arrived with his plan still firmly in his mind. Holly would set him up with someone and he'd be cordial. Then he felt the magic of the holidays bundled in this beautiful room with the lights, the shining townspeople, the expansive dance floor, and the Christmas music. He talked with people he knew and didn't know, all welcoming him and wishing him happiness. He didn't want to just be cordial. He wanted to relax and be himself, not on another mission. Holly had appeared in a stunning red dress with her blonde curls twirling over her shoulders. She wore silver earrings and matching silver heels with rhinestones. She looked like Christmas itself. As he watched her smile beaming while she talked to people, he remembered the way she'd welcomed him his first days here and walked arm in arm down Main Street. She was the only woman he wanted to dance with, maybe for the rest of his life, even if that made no rational sense. Now he whirled her in his arms as she positively glowed. "I made an offer on the bookstore," he said. Her beautiful blue eyes widened. "You did? That's wonderful. Can you swing the shop beside it to add your coffee shop? It's a brilliant idea." "That's the plan. I'll come every day and buy an espresso. Maybe carve out a little place to get work done for an hour or so before I go into the office." Silent Night ended and Jingle Bell Rock played. They danced faster as the floor grew more crowded. Soon they had inadvertently separated as the dance floor became one large conglomeration of people moving and swaying, a partnerless swarm. He worked his way back to Holly just as Baby It's Cold Outside started playing. He took her back into his arms. "I feel like we should end the evening roasting chestnuts on an open fire," he said. "Oh, I just fixed my fireplace." "Is that an invitation?" She bit her lip. "My place is a mess. I mean, I'm not a messy person, but I'm doing a lot of repairs." "I don't mind. I'd invite you to my fireplace, but it's gas and closed in, not ideal for roasting." And part of him wanted to see inside her house, another glimpse into Holly's life. If it was anything like the back porch he'd seen at a distance, he would be tempted to offer to pay to fix it, but he couldn't let himself do that. She might take his offer as an offensive gesture that he didn't think she could do it herself. "Okay, my place." Her smile brightened and then faltered. "Just sitting by the fire. I promise to be a gentleman." Her cheeks flushed. "I might want a goodnight kiss, though, if it isn't too much to ask." He grinned. "I could agree to that, but I think I should preview what I'm agreeing to." His arms tightened slightly around her as he drew her nearer. She tilted her head up as he lowered his lips to her, soft and sweet, but with a hint of passion just below the surface, begging to be released. He stepped back dumbstruck. "I can agree to a goodnight kiss." Eyes wide, she touched fingers to her lips. "I'll get our coats." He turned and let out a shaky breath. "Drex, you idiot. Her place?" This was a terrible idea. He was falling for this woman and this town. He couldn't let that happen. Could he? Wasn't putting down roots like this what he wanted? Except his name hadn't been cleared yet, so he didn't know if or when he'd be forced to violently uproot himself. He couldn't delude himself into thinking he was safe just because a few weeks of normalcy had passed. He picked up the coats and turned to look for Holly. She made her way through the crowd, talking to people as she went. He leaned against the wall to wait patiently, admiring her natural charisma and social skills. Zelinsky rolled the warmer between his hands as he waited outside the town recreational center. He loathed this part of spy work, long waits and cramped cold cars, especially with the crap motel he'd been attempting to sleep in the last few days. He was living off fast food and poor sleep quality while spending his days trying to avoid frostbite. He rubbed his eyes and tried to ignore the throbbing around his temples and gnawing sensation in his upper abdomen. He chewed another 2 antacids. He watched as a happy couple walked arm in arm out of the rec center and through the parking lot. Oh, this was rich. 1 month out of the business, and Drex Allister was falling over himself for a woman. Had he forgotten all of his training and become complacent so quickly? Not likely. Drex was probably playing some angle here. To what end, Zelinsky couldn't fathom. What if this blonde chick was an agent? That would complicate the situation. He scrutinized the pair of them. If she was an agent, with her Barbie smile and dainty stride, then Zelinsky was the patron saint of basket makers. No, this broad was just Drex's next tumble between the sheets. Unless she was something more significant. If Zelinsky was going to get the drop on Drex, he needed to use every angle he could. Perhaps this woman would be useful. He would continue to tail the two of them and see if she was an exploitable weakness. Drex and the woman climbed in separate cars, but no goodbye kiss had been exchanged to suggest the night had concluded. He'd bet they would be going to the same place, hers or Drex's. He started his car, instantly grateful for the heat. He hadn't wanted to let it idle and have the exhaust fumes condense on the air and give away his location. Too bad Drex hadn't had the decency to escape somewhere warmer to die. Chapter 8. Holly unlocked the door, and Drex followed her inside her house. She turned on the lights on her way to the living room. The bubbly sensation which had built on the dance floor began to decrescendo as she felt self-conscious about a guest in her unfinished home, as if it was somehow a window to her life, an unfinished work in progress. Then again, whose life wasn't? Since she wanted to spend more time getting to know Drex, her house seemed like the ideal place. It was a renovator's dream. Nothing about the atmosphere oozed romance. "Is it always so chilly in here?" he asked. "The house is drafty." "Drafty? There are lean-tos that hold better heat." She chuckled and added tinder under the fireplace logs. "I thought I'd have more work done on the place by now." She started the fire. "You'll have the satisfaction of a job well done when it is." "I thought so when I bought it. Now it's become all-consuming of my time. I think we have a love-hate relationship." Drex stood behind her and rubbed his hand up and down her arms along her coat. Her body was keenly aware of his proximity. "Thanks. I don't have chestnuts, but I do have marshmallows." "I love roasted marshmallows. But first, let's give the fire time to warm up the room." They sat on the couch, and Drex pulled the throw blanket over her. He kept his distance and managed to look relaxed despite his formal wear. "Tell me about why you ran out on your wedding day," he said gently. "No preamble, huh? Straight to the heavy stuff?" "Okay. Harry was the perfect man. Everyone said so. We were the perfect couple. Everyone said so. The longer we were together, the more I saw a darker side of him." She fidgeted with the frayed edges of the blanket. "All little things. Criticisms of the way I drove, or talked too much, or acted clumsily. I always brushed them off, even as his words slowly corroded my self-confidence and self-esteem." She pursed her lips. "But we were perfect together. Everyone said so." Drex scooted closer and took her hand. "How bad did it get?" "Never physical harm, but the threat of danger always lurked like a shadow when he was near. Sometimes it was in the way he'd slam a door, just barely missing me or my fingers, or the time he backed quickly out of the driveway in anger, and I had to jump out of the way." She hesitated, gauging Drex's reaction. His expression was one of concern and interest. "So, after 5 years together, I stared at myself in the mirror wearing a chiffon, off-the-shoulder, sleeveless, floor-length wedding dress and about to commit to this person for a lifetime. A lifetime of what? Criticism? Domination? Something worse?" She pushed to her feet, the blanket falling back to the couch. She stoked the fire and the warmth filled the room. Drex silently came to stand by her side. She continued, "I ran. It felt incredibly liberating to take my life back. I haven't seen Harry since. My family was mortified and humiliated. They know where I've been for the last 3 years, but they've never visited." "Did you explain to them how toxic he was?" "I tried a few times over the years before my grand exit, but they dismissed my feelings, treated me as if I was overreacting." You did the right thing, Drex said. She turned to look up at him. My timing could have been better. Better late than never. He drew her back into his arms, pressing her back against his chest. I haven't dated since. How much do you really get to know someone? How do you know somebody's darker side isn't going to pose a threat? And Harry's came on so subtly, I almost let myself be swallowed by it. Behind her, Drex went very still. Maybe she had shared too much, but telling another person her experience, fears, and reservations felt cathartic. How about those marshmallows, he said, taking a step back from her. She turned to look up at him and saw only warmth and compassion, not an ounce of judgment. Yes, I'll get them. Restroom, he asked. She grimaced. The one downstairs doesn't work. Upstairs and to the right, but be careful on the stairs. Stay to the left. There's a loose board on the right, and don't rely on the handrail. Drex walked the stairs carefully, needing to distance himself from Holly before he kissed her again. He'd liked kissing her on the dance floor, but he didn't want to take something too fast and fool himself or Holly about where the two of them were heading. He inspected the area Holly had referred to as a loose board. Ugh, it was actually broken. One misstep and a leg would go right through. This place wasn't safe. Holly, this place isn't even to code, he called as he continued to climb. It was straight out of the Tom Hanks movie, The Money Pit, except Drex wondered if it was worth the trouble of repairing it. But the house was Holly's pet project. He wouldn't criticize her, but he began to worry about her safety here. He reached the upstairs bathroom, which appeared in good condition. Holly had done a great job in here, and he could see what she was capable of. The blue tones with cherry wood cabinets. He possessed no handyman skills, but he had the urge to help her nonetheless. What would it feel like to lay tile with her, paint a room, sand a floor? He could picture her in torn jeans with her hair in some messy updo. As he washed his hands, he took a hard look at himself in the mirror and ran a hand over trim facial hair. He was failing at his plans to keep his distance. The more time he spent with her, the more time he wanted to spend with her. But he had secrets, and until he resolved his burned status, he wasn't safe to be around. Her question by the fire had struck him like a heavyweight knockout. How do you know somebody's darker side isn't going to pose a threat? When he returned downstairs, Holly had marshmallows at the ready. The room had warmed enough. She'd taken her coat off and sat in front of the fire. Watching her glow by firelight in her red dress stole his breath away. He'd known hiding was only temporary while he formulated a plan. However, now more than ever, he needed to clear his name so he could build a better life. As he sat down, Holly handed him a skewer with the fluffy white dessert on the tip. What do you remember from high school? She asked. He thought for a moment. He remembered never fitting in, but didn't dwell on it. Even as a teenager, he recognized that those years didn't dictate his future, though he had chosen a life of keeping himself closed to others, so perhaps high school had an element of foreshadowing. Coach Simon and Elmo, he said. Elmo? This kid in PE was always picked on. I came in a few months into the year, so I didn't know anybody. I broke up a bullying in the locker room and finally asked the guy why everybody called him Elmo. Turns out his parents actually included that in his name, Franklin Elmo Moss. Apparently everyone knew him as Frank until the first day of PE, his senior year, when Coach Simon asked what the E stood for. Then the coach continuously called him Elmo. Months of humiliation ensued after that. But you helped him. Drex shrugged. The other kids didn't mess with him at PE, but I didn't think the rest of his days were kind to him. He did all right, though, went to college and became an engineer. So you did make friends in high school. She nudged his elbow playfully. Acquaintances, he smiled. And after high school? I went to college, then traveled internationally as a consultant. He inwardly cringed at the consultant lie. Opening up about his spy work would demolish the lovely evening they were enjoying. If he was going to spend more time with her, he would need to explain his real career. Holly's blue eyes had a tropical glow by the firelight. I envy your travel. I have been working on a list of places I want to visit. I've been saving up, which is part of the reason I'm doing a lot of this house myself. I'm trying not to dip into my travel savings. They continued to talk about places he'd been and places she wanted to go as the minutes and hours slipped by. Drex stoked the fire as he glanced at his watch. I had a wonderful time, and I'm going to head back while it's still a gentlemanly hour to leave. He helped her stand, pulling her into his arms when she was on her feet. Thank you for sharing tonight with me, and thank you for sharing your past. I owe you the story behind my fresh start, and I promise I will make that a topic for discussion next time we're alone together. I look forward to it. She wrapped her arms around him and pressed her lips to his in a slow, deep kiss. Drex pulled away, feeling he didn't deserve the affection she so readily gave. You make saying goodbye difficult. I am leaving now, but we'll pick up where we left off. She was smiling from ear to ear in an expression of such happiness and adoration that he felt 10 feet tall. He walked away, came back, gave her 3 more kisses in quick succession, and then forced himself to leave. Ironically, neither of them had been looking for a relationship when they found each other. Now they seemed to be heading that direction. As soon as he exited her house, the darkness of the winter night closed in around him. Holly had looked so happy. Would he destroy that when he told her the truth about who he was? He didn't want to hurt her, but at this point it seemed inevitable. The next morning, Drex checked his email in his pajamas as he sipped coffee. He had one word from Chester's encrypted account: trouble. He choked on the sip of coffee he'd started taking as his heart plummeted. Idiot, idiot, idiot. He was dreaming up plans for a happily ever after in the arms of a beautiful woman as if he didn't have a bounty on his head. Pipe dreams. With a lump in his throat, he called Chester, not knowing what country or even what time zone she was in. It could have been the middle of the night for all he knew, but trouble wasn't an email title he didn't take lightly. Drex? Chester, what trouble? He held his breath. They know where you are, she said solemnly. Who are they exactly? CIA. They sent a hitman. Even though Drex had considered the possibility, it devastated him to hear it. He took the stairs 2 at a time and put Chester on speaker as he quickly dressed and thought of the chilling Ernest Hemingway quote, "There is no hunting like the hunting of man, and those who have hunted men long enough and liked it never care for anything else thereafter." Chester continued, and Zielinski's got enough friends in the organization. If they know, he knows. He hasn't been at the office for a few days, according to Gruber. A few days? Drex felt nauseated. If he'd been spying on himself, a lot could be learned in a few days. He should have trusted his sense of being watched intermittently and been more careful. What would Zielinski have seen covertly? Holly. If his traitorous ex-boss wanted to make Drex vulnerable, he only needed to go after Holly. After pulling on black slacks, he shrugged on a shirt and buttoned it. You're quiet, Chester said. Usually at this point in the conversation, you would be telling me you're packing, leaving, and activating a new alias. I can't cut and run. There's somebody here I care about. He thought about where Holly would be right now, probably getting ready for the holiday parade she'd mentioned last night. How are you going to fix this? You've got the CIA and Zielinski bearing down on you, and an innocent who could get caught in the crossfire. The first thing I need to do is tell Holly the truth. He scampered down the stairs and tugged on his boots, followed by lacing them. Holly? That's her name? Chester snorted. Yes, you definitely need to come clean about your pseudonym. You can't marry her and give her a name like Holly Holiday. You're a barrel of laughs, Chester, he deadpanned. He slipped his gun into his holster, zipped up his coat, and headed out into the cold. You'll call me if you get wind of anything else? I will. Drex pocketed his phone and walked to Main Street, where he was surprised to see the elbow-to-elbow crowd along both sides of the road, tourists and townsfolk both, ready to watch the parade. One by one, trucks pulling floats drove slowly down the road, with music playing from loudspeakers. He suspected the weather was a bit cold for a marching band. The first float looked like something out of Candyland, with marshmallows hanging from pink trees, life-size candy canes sticking out of gumdrops large enough to sit on, and a giant gingerbread house. The second float had a blue and white castle with twinkling lights. After the winter wonderland came a float with the outline of a train, brilliantly lit with hundreds of colored lights. The fourth float was Santa's sleigh. Sheriff Carpenter, decked out in a full red velvet suit, shiny black boots, and a Santa hat, waved to the crowd. Beside him, Holly the elf smiled and waved. There was no way the elf outfit was warm enough for the weather, and Drex felt the urge to haul her back to the fireside and wrap the blanket around her again. The final float was a giant Christmas tree with shiny red and green presents, boxes large enough for people to fit inside. The unnerving tingling sensation of being watched returned. He scanned the crowd, but saw no one watching him or standing out in the crowd. He worked his way down the sidewalk where a toddler fought his mother's grip as she was turned toward her middle child, who seemed to be arguing with her mother about something. The toddler squirmed with all his might, face wrinkled in determination, as his tiny gloved hand slipped through his mother's fingers. Free at last, he wobbled in his little boots, stiff in his heavy winter coat. Then he turned and ran, face gleeful from his hard-earned freedom, but oblivious to the large tire of the float bearing down on him. Having predicted the projected path of the boy, Drex was already in motion. When he broke through the crowd, he dropped to his knees, the momentum sliding him across ice and snow. He scooped up the child as he spun away from vehicle before bringing them both to a halt when he dug his boot in the snow. The woman gasped, and the boy giggled at the ride. Drex offered him up to her. "You saved him!" Tears welled in her eyes as a small group of people gaped at Drex. He stood and brushed snow off his pants. "No problem," he murmured. "Wait, let me thank you!" But he was already disappearing into the crowd. In spy work, drawing attention to oneself was an occupational hazard. The spotlight and a sniper's crosshairs could be one and the same. He didn't want anyone's praise or recognition. When the parade ended, people dispersed inside the shops along Main Street, the bakery, the bookstore, the bistro. Regardless of their destinations, people sought warmth. Drex walked down to the recreation center where the Santa float had parked. That must be where they were holding Santa's workshop and visitation. By the time he reached the inside, a line of anxious children and equally jittery parents, ready with their camera phones, stretched to the door. At the beginning of the line was the North Pole with Santa and his elf. Drex hung back. Nothing untoward would happen to Holly in a public place such as this. But if Zelensky and the CIA truly did know Drex's location, he might catch them in the act of spying. Drex vigilantly observed, hoping to glimpse the watchers watching. He didn't see Zelensky's broad body, nor anyone acting suspiciously. When the line ended, Holly disappeared to the back toward the restroom, where Drex suspected she would change before heading home. He would wait for her there, walk her to her car, and explain the situation. "Hi, I'm a burned spy who has put you in danger by association. Do you still want to date?" Maybe he should work the kinks out of his speech first. As he headed in Holly's direction, a large figure stepped between him and his destination. He blinked at the gleaming red suit and fluffy hat. Sheriff Carpenter. He tried to keep the irritation out of his voice. The sheriff removed his Santa hat.
"I think it's time you and I had a chat, Drex Allister."
Chapter 9. "Happy to oblige after I see Holly home safe," Drex told Sheriff Carpenter.
"Holly has been seeing herself home just fine for the last 3 years in this town. I'm sure she'll manage."
He gave Drex a curt smile that, with his Santa suit on, made Drex feel like he'd made the naughty list. Perhaps he had. Between losing an informant in Prague, getting burned, having his new identity crumble and potentially involving a woman in his danger. The last month had been a series of unfortunate events culminating in inevitable disaster. Drex grit his teeth but didn't argue. He didn't want to make a scene at the rec center with the sheriff in front of families. He sensed that if he resisted, the sheriff intended to use force. If he truly was going to make a fresh start in this town, assaulting the sheriff, especially with him dressed like Santa in a room full of children, would be counterproductive to those goals. He detested the idea of leaving Holly alone, but a showdown with the sheriff wasn't going to get him any closer to her. The best he could hope for was that his cooperation would speed this interaction along. Drex walked side by side with the sheriff back out into the cold. "What's this about?"
Let's get toasty indoors. We can talk more over a cup of coffee.
There was nothing friendly or toasty about the sheriff's invitation for coffee, and Drex suspected this conversation would take place in the sheriff's office, not the bistro. Joe Carpenter would want to have this discussion on his territory. Whether the intention was to intimidate Drex or because the sheriff feared what Drex might do in a confrontation, Drex wasn't sure. He'd been in enough tight spots and tense situations that being questioned in a small-town sheriff's office wouldn't faze him. But angst gnawed at his insides when he thought about how he was leaving Holly unguarded in the wake of this morning's news from Chester. Danger was already closing in on him and could spill over onto her life. As they walked down Main Street, Drex wondered if the sheriff would go so far as to frisk him. If he did, he would find his gun, and although Drex had a license to carry a concealed weapon, as Chris Holliday, he suspected such a discovery would only lengthen his time away from Holly. When they reached the sheriff's office, Carpenter pulled open the door and let Drex enter first.
"Come on and have a seat by my desk over there."
The entire office consisted of 3 desks in the small hallway leading to a back room, presumably where a jail cell might be. Just one, judging by the overall size of the building. A deputy sat in uniform typing at his computer. Drex left his coat buttoned to keep his gun concealed as he sat. "What has you concerned, Sheriff?" Sheriff Carpenter pulled off his Santa coat, beneath which was a taupe-colored long-sleeve shirt. He adjusted the badge on his belt before sitting down.
"I don't like strangers with strange identities nesting in my town. I heard Holly call you Drex Allister in the bistro a while back after you clearly identified yourself to me as Chris Holliday. Turns out Drex Allister is a bit of a ghost. Foster homes here and there and then off the grid for a decade."
Drex pursed lips. He would have to take a gamble that telling the truth was the most direct route to getting protection on Holly. The sheriff hadn't arrested him yet or surrounded him with men, which mean he didn't know Drex was wanted by the CIA. He didn't know the U.S. government suspected Drex of foul play and the assassination of a Czech citizen planning to defect. "The reason I don't have a traceable history in the last 10 years is that I was a spy."
"What are you telling me? That you're CIA?"
Drex suppressed an eye roll. Why did everyone assume American spy equaled CIA? There were dozens of private spy agencies, the sum of which outnumbered the Central Intelligence Agency's number of officers doing covert fieldwork. No, not CIA, a private organization. Sometimes I did work for the CIA. In November, I was double-crossed during an information transfer. I came here in hiding with a new identity because I made the reasonable assumption that the person who double-crossed me would like to silence me. Permanently.
"Why would this person want to silence you?"
the sheriff asked. "That's classified. However, we have a more immediate concerning problem. I learned just this morning that the crooked spy has identified my new nesting spot." He chose the sheriff's term for emphasis. He also suspected the sheriff's digging was what alerted the CIA to Drex's new home, but he wasn't going to win the man over by pointing out that his curiosity probably facilitated endangering Holly. After all, Drex was ultimately the one to blame after spending so much time with her.
You're going to stick with this line of answers, that you're a spy.
I'll give you an example. Reginald, the banker, is having an affair.
Everybody knows that. He's seeing Julie Taylor.
Yes, and her daughter. The sheriff's eyes went wide.
She's only 18.
Yes, not a healthy situation. And Mrs. Rice is stealing money from the bistro tip jar. Sheriff Carpenter grunted. And the Matthews kid is your firebug. He raised an eyebrow at Drex. You've been looking for who has been starting fires in the woods. At least I assume so, based on the newspaper articles.
So why did you go to a Christmas parade? If you're some super spy with people after you, shouldn't you be moving on to the next town?
Carpenter leaned back and crossed his arms, clearly not willing to entertain the idea that an urgency existed to the situation. Because I suspect he'll go after Holly to get to me.
And that's why you've been following Holly around all morning like a stalker?
Drex wondered if his behavior this morning had been what prompted the sheriff to act on his desire to confront Drex. Yes, and now she's unguarded because I'm here. Carpenter regarded him but didn't move. Can I go now? The worry in Drex's chest that had started like an ache now became a tight band.
It's quite a story you've concocted.
It's the truth.
Could be. Could be you're delusional, and you're the real threat to Holly.
I'm not delusional. Sheriff Carpenter stood and came around the desk.
Be that as it may.
He withdrew a pair of handcuffs and slapped them on Drex's left wrist while simultaneously connecting him to the chair.
I'm going to let you hang out here until we get some answers.
Drex looked at the handcuffs in disbelief. Seriously? Are you arresting me? Because I haven't heard my rights yet.
I'm considering arresting you.
On what charges?
We'll start with possession of a fake ID. I'm sure your driver's license says Chris Holliday. And then we will see what else crops up. The only reason I'm not throwing you in the cell this very instant is that I saw you save Molly's little boy from the float. Man who'd do that deserves one chance to prove himself. One.
With unhurried motions, the sheriff walked back around his desk and picked up his brown, fur-lined wool coat. As he pulled it on, he looked toward the deputy across the room at his desk.
Ned, please keep an eye on our guest.
You're making a mistake, Joe, Drex said. His voice held an edge of plea rather than a threat, but that didn't seem to faze the sheriff. The white-bearded man gave him one last hard look before leaving. Holly arrived home humming Christmas songs. She'd seen Drex at the parade and Santa's workshop. He looked strained, but perhaps his tension had been due to the cold weather. He'd vanished when she'd looked for him after she changed, but she decided she would call him later. She felt light as a feather dancing in Drex's arms last night, and the effervescent sensation lingered after he'd left her house. When she'd finally fallen asleep, it was after midnight. The next morning she'd dressed and gone to the parade, thinking only of the next time she could see him. Starving after the parade and workshop, she popped a bagel in the toaster. Figgy appeared in the kitchen, floating above the counter. She hadn't seen him since before the party. Figgy McJingle, magic was in the air last night. Did you see it? Could you feel it? You found your match. He's quite the catch. I could have danced all night. I could have talked all night. I could have been convinced into doing some other things last night, too, but it would have been too fast. It already feels fast, but in a good way. Does that make sense? She smeared hazelnut cream cheese on the bagel. Both of you were glowing, but I am not all-knowing. Figgy, did you see what he did in front of the float? He saved that toddler. Just whooshed in with no thought for his own safety and like he saw the whole thing coming. She puzzled, picturing the event in her mind. You don't think he has someone like you, a ghost who forewarned him about the child? She took a bite of her bagel. He sees no ghosts, but there's no time to boast. His small brow wrinkled in worry. Danger has arrived in town. Holly let out a disbelieving chuckle. Danger? What danger? In Blitzen? Dangerous men are coming round. Figgy's small, worried voice sent a chill down her spine. The cards are cast. Drex has a past. You'll have to be strong to right the wrong. He'll need your help, too, if your feelings are true. Holly looked down at the unfinished bagel. What are you talking about in his past? And what wrong? My feelings are true. What am I supposed to do? Ugh, he had her rhyming again. But he also had her genuinely worried. If Drex needed her help, she would help. What was Figgy trying to tell her? Maybe Drex would need her help but not think he could ask for it. She might suspect an unwillingness to ask for help from a man in a tux. Oh, that tux. Her knees went watery again. Figgy, as clearly as you can, tell me what I need to do to help Drex. Big man with big hands, don't try to make a stand. Grab your keys with the scare, retreat to the stairs. I'll call Drex. She could clear up this whole danger looming nonsense by talking to Drex. She snatched up her phone and dialed his number. As it rang and rang and rang, she poured herself a large glass of water and quenched her parched throat. No answer, she told the elf ghost as worry pricked along her skin. A knock came at the door, causing her to jump, and her heart thudded against her chest. If Figgy hadn't mentioned danger, she would think nothing of a visitor and readily open the door. Instead, she stood paralyzed. Had she locked the door? Yes, she remembered. But it was an old door that wouldn't withstand someone determined to get in the house, someone dangerous. Dangerous men are coming round. She looked at Figgy, who shook his head in warning. She took his motion as an indication that Drex wasn't the person knocking at her door. She crept silently to the front door to where her boots rested and slipped them on. Another bang, bang, bang. Miss Sanders, I know you're in there. We need to talk about Drex Allister. As she grabbed her coat and keys, she glimpsed the silhouette of the man on the other side of the door. The big man, as Figgy had described him. Miss Sanders? Without answering, she backed away slowly. A loud clatter resounded through the house as the front door cracked violently and swung open on its hinges. Holly let out a yelp and retreated toward the stairs. A gunshot rang so loud she thought it might have shattered her eardrum. Wood splintered in the banister to her left where the bullet struck. She froze 1/3 of the way up the stairs. Shaking, she turned around to face the gunman. He wore a brown overcoat over his large torso. Salt and pepper hair covered his head, framing a square face with drooping jowls. His eyes were a cold, eerie calm, deceptive and deadly as black ice. I just want to talk, Miss Sanders. My door and your gun would suggest otherwise. She tried to calm her tremulous body. She'd never heard a gunshot in her life, much less been shot at. You could have opened the door. You didn't, which means you already suspect trouble. Did Allister tell you he's on the run from the CIA, or did he feed you lies? I'm one of the good guys, Miss Sanders. Come down, and I'll explain everything over a cup of coffee. He told me everything, she lied. She took a cautious step backward up the stairs, thinking of Figgy's words. Don't try to make a stand. Don't take another step or the next bullet goes in you. Not something one of the good guys would say, she pointed out in a high-pitched voice. And this man obviously wanted her alive to use against Drex, which meant Figgy was right, and running away was her best option. Her only option. She bolted up and into the master bedroom. Behind her, the man cursed and started up the stairs. When she heard a crash, she knew he'd planted a foot onto and through the loose board. That would buy her a little time. She pulled on her coat and stuffed the keys in her pocket. She opened the master bedroom sliding glass door that led to the deck, the rickety, crooked deck with rotting boards that she hadn't replaced yet. Gingerly, she picked her way across the wood to the brittle railing. Below, a snowdrift had piled against her shed. It would be the softest place to land. She kicked boards out of the way. As she stared at the drop below, her nerve faltered. Jump, jump, jump. She silently repeated the words, but her body didn't move. Footsteps up the stairs resumed. No time for anything else. She pushed off the deck. For a moment, she was flying. Fear made her stomach flip and her whole body tensed for impact. In a poof of white powder, she landed in the soft snow and sank to her waist. "Stop!" the angry man shouted. Holly looked up in time to see him stomp out onto the deck. "Your mistake, big guy." The entire structure shimmied, and he couldn't aim his gun as he tried to maintain his balance. Holly waded through the snow, agonizingly slower than she would have liked, as her pursuer wobbled precariously on the deck. Once she'd freed herself from the snow pile, she dashed for her car. As she climbed inside, snow from her clothes poofed in a flurry of white, coating her seats and dashboard. She started the engine, backed out, and reached the road. "Figgy, where is Drex?" Her voice came in rapid pants as she gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled fear. He appeared beside her. "Go to his house. You'll meet a mouse. The truth is there, but do take care." A mouse? She shook her head in exasperation. She tried to ask Figgy more information as they drove, but he only gave her more riddles. When she pulled into Drex's driveway, his car wasn't there. She turned and blinked at Figgy. Now what? "Knock on the door. The truth you'll explore." As she walked toward the door, her heart rate started to creep higher. Over the course of the drive here, the relentless pounding had finally subsided since jumping off her back deck. Warily, she walked up the steps and knocked on the door. A tall, lean man, 10 years older than Drex, answered the door. He wore a navy suit that enhanced his predatorial features: high cheeks, narrow nose, sharp eyes. "You must be Holly. My name is Spinner." Chapter 10. Drex surveyed the sheriff's office for a second time. Handcuffs weren't a problem, but he didn't want to hurt the deputy. Although Sheriff Carpenter didn't believe his spy story, he seemed to worry that Holly could be in real danger. Drex hoped that meant the next place Carpenter would go was Holly's house. He'd feel better knowing the sheriff was checking on her safety. Except the sheriff wasn't a match for a CIA hitman, nor Zelinsky. Neither of them would have much reservation about eliminating the sheriff and would probably turn the blame on Drex. "Bathroom break?" he asked Ned, starting to stand. The deputy shook his head as he continued to type on his computer. The work looked like some type of mundane data entry. Drex lowered himself back down, discreetly pulling a paperclip off the sheriff's desk. He made quick work of releasing the cuffs. The slight metallic noise inaudible to the deputy over the sounds of Christmas music playing in the room. As he let the handcuffs fall, Drex whipped out his gun and pointed it at the deputy. The man looked up at him, stunned and terrified, without even having time to reach for his own weapon. Up, slowly. "My apologies for this, Ned, but I need to make sure Holly is safe." The deputy rose, tentatively, hands raised in the air. 2 fingers, gun out, and set it on the desk. He did as he was instructed. "Walk around and down the hall to the jail." Drex followed Ned, gun still trained on him. "Door open. You step in, toss me the keys, and close the door." Ned hesitated, as if considering a counterattack. "If you're wondering if you're fast enough, you're not," Drex said. After Ned reluctantly stepped inside the cell, Drex locked the door. Next, he holstered his weapon and dashed for the front door, where a blast of cold wind struck him. He took off at a sprint, boots crunching on snow. He would have to go to his house first to get his car and then drive to Holly's place. He pulled out his phone as he ran and saw he had a missed call from her. He couldn't decide if that made him feel better or worse about whether or not trouble had reached her. He was about to call her back when he turned the corner onto Pine Street and saw her car parked in his drive. Once again, he didn't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing. He continued his dash through the snow. He could have laughed at the irony if he wasn't weighted with worry. When he reached the front porch, he pulled out his gun again. He listened for a minute as he caught his breath. People were talking inside his house. Holly's voice. She sounded like her usual bubbly self and not in any distress. The ache in his chest eased slightly. Who was she talking to? Was she on her phone? And how had she gotten inside his house? She had returned the spare key. He unlocked the door and opened it, leading with his gun as he entered. He risked scaring the daylight out of Holly with his weapon, but he didn't want to take any chances with her safety in the event he was entering a dangerous situation. When Drex reached his living room, he saw Holly sitting on his recliner and CIA officer Stan Spinner on his couch. From what he could tell, Drex was the only one holding a weapon. That didn't make Stan any less of a threat. He was a known killer in the spy business. Cursing, Zielinski brushed off snow and limped from Holly's backyard to his car. He'd sprained an ankle and just about threw out his shoulder when the piece of junk deck came crashing down. To make matters worse, Barbie escaped, car and all. She would probably run to her boyfriend, which would alert Drex Allister to his presence. The pair of them would have a good 10 minutes head start, so he may not catch up to them. When a police cruiser pulled into the drive behind his car, Zielinski was relieved he'd holstered his weapon out of sight before leaving Holly's backyard. He held up his credentials for the sheriff to see. "Glad you're here, Sheriff. I'm Victor Zielinski. I work with the CIA." The sheriff, as broad as himself, sported a generous white beard. He kept one hand on the pistol on his waist as he approached and took Zielinski's cred pack. He sized him up as any good law enforcement would do, probably noticing Zielinski's rough appearance, as though he'd been mauled by a bear.
"This says you're in private security."
He handed the cred pack back to Zielinski. He pocketed it. "That's right. I'm looking for a rogue agent who used to work for me. Name's Drex Allister, though I suspect he would be using one of his many aliases since he's in hiding." Zielinski opted to skirt as close to the truth as he could, since he didn't know how much the sheriff had already unearthed.
"Mr. Allister doesn't live here."
"No, sir, he wasn't at his place, so I tried the woman's home whom I saw him with earlier. She's not home either." He gave him a disarming smile. The sheriff hiked his pants up around his waist.
"Mr. Allister is in my custody at present."
"Oh, good. That's better for the safety of this town." Zielinski tried to keep his smile from turning into clenched teeth. He couldn't eliminate Drex in front of the sheriff, not easily anyway. And after too many nights in a crappy motel with a clunky heater, days of cold exposure in his vehicle, and falling to injury on a busted deck, he desperately wanted to shoot Drex.
"Why don't you ride with me? We'll go speak with him together."
Zielinski wanted to recoil at the very idea of riding in some hick's car and being stuck at the sheriff's department without his own vehicle, especially if he needed to make a quick getaway after eliminating Drex. But he needed to appear cooperative if the sheriff was going to trust him to spend time with Drex, or even let him take the ex-spy into custody. "Thank you. Great idea." They climbed into the cruiser, and the sheriff backed out of Holly's driveway. "I'm glad you have him contained. He's a danger to society." The sheriff cast him a sideways glance. "Killed a man in the Czech Republic," Zielinski added. He resisted the urge to rub at the rising burning sensation in his stomach. His antacids were back in his vehicle.
"That's so."
"It's a CIA matter, so I can't go into the details."
"I understand."
The sheriff's phone rang, and he answered it, putting the call on speaker.
"Ned, I'm here with someone who used to work with Drex Allister. We're on our way to you now."
"He got away!" the man on the other end of the line shouted.
"What?"
"He got out of the cuffs, pulled a gun on me, and got away." When Sheriff Carpenter looked at him, Zielinski pursed his lips as if to say this turn of events emphasized how dangerous he'd been telling the sheriff Allister was.
"Are you hurt?"
the sheriff asked Ned. "I'm okay. He locked me in the jail cell, but I still had my phone on me."
"He's on foot."
"I think so. Didn't take any of our keys."
"Then I'll head to his place. He'd go there first for his vehicle."
"What about me?" Ned asked.
"If he didn't take any keys, then you have the jail keys there."
"Yeah, but I can't get to them."
"You have your phone, Ned. Call someone who'll let you out. Maybe pick someone who won't blab to the town about how the deputy got locked in his own jail cell."
He disconnected the call. When the sheriff took the next hard right, Zielinski wanted to shout with glee. If Drex was at his house instead of the sheriff's office, the less controlled situation with fewer witnesses could prove to be the perfect situation. He could eliminate Drex, maybe the sheriff too, since the white-bearded man seemed a little too savvy for his own good. If he rigged the scene correctly, He could make it look like Drex killed the sheriff. Then he could take Drex's car back to Holly's house, reclaim his car, leave town, and no one would be the wiser. Drex! Drex regarded her wide, albeit somewhat tentative smile, but kept his gun trained on Spinner. Holly stood but didn't approach Drex. I would give you a hug, but you look a little scary right now. You're not hurt. No, she shook her head. Drex wanted to get closer to her, but he couldn't lower his guard, with Spinner 20 feet away. Stan, you're looking well. He kept his voice cool. Alistair, Merry Christmas. Stan remained very still, as if wanting to demonstrate to Drex that he wasn't a threat, but Drex knew what a man like Stan was capable of doing. He could go from 0 to 60 before Drex had a chance to shoot him down. It's okay, Drex, Holly said. Stan explained how you used to be a spy and how you got out when Zelinsky double-crossed you. Stan is here for the intel from Prague. Drex cocked his head to one side and regarded Holly. She was accepting of all this? His distrusting spy mentality wondered for a moment if she was somehow part of this, a plant to deceive him. But that was impossible. He dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it occurred. He noted some scrapes on her hand and one across her cheek, just enough that they were tiny streaks of red. Are you hurt? He asked again. No, she shook her head. But I did meet your former boss. Zelinsky claimed he wanted to talk, but he did more shooting than talking. Shooting? Drex's stomach nodded. Holly had been in danger because of him. Alistair, Stan interjected. We only have part of Ludwig's intel, and we have reason to believe he gave you the other part. Let me take the information you have back to Langley. Let me clear your name. Why do you believe I'm innocent? Stan hadn't threatened Holly and hadn't taken any action to stage his own house before Drex arrived. Maybe he did believe Drex was innocent. Stan slowly stood. A guilty man who sabotages a mission for financial gain does not proceed to get the defector's family out of the country for safety. Those were not the actions of a self-serving spy. How did you know that? Drex asked in surprise. You saved my life, Alistair. Maybe Amsterdam was just another day on the job for you, but I would have died if you hadn't risked your life to take the extra time to save me. When I was assigned to your case after Prague, I knew they had misinformation. I used a few connections and dug a little deeper. I've been watching you for the last week, and then watching Zelinsky watching you. So here we are. Can you put the gun away? Drex recalled the Amsterdam incident. He'd been there to retrieve information from a former Irish Republican Army fanatic at a building that was going to be bombed by Turkish terrorists. Stan was being held captive there. When Drex learned about the American, he made a brief off-the-books side mission. He didn't do more than incapacitate 2 guards and an interrogator and pack Stan into a taxi, but apparently he'd made an impression. Drex holstered his gun. Do you know where Zelinsky is now? Holly looked like she wanted to hug Drex, but the slightest reservation hovered in her expression. She must have seen the way he looked at her just for an instant, as if she was part of the conspiracy against him. He walked toward her. Holly, I'm so sorry for dragging you into this and putting you in harm's way. He wrapped his arms around her. Thankfully, she returned the embrace. I'm okay, shocked but okay. Last I saw Zelinsky, he was teetering on my deck. Keeping one arm around Holly, Drex disconnected the tiny USB from his watch and handed it to Stan. He had this copy he'd made from the phone download at Letna Park. I didn't want to part with it until I could be sure it would be in the right hands. Whatever is on there, it cost a man his life. Stan nodded solemnly as he accepted it. A loud knock sounded at the door. Mr. Alistair, it's Sheriff Carpenter. I'm here with Victor Zelinsky. We can take off out the back, Stan suggested in a whisper. Drex squeezed Holly closer. This is my home. You get that information in the right hands. I'll answer to the sheriff. Stan gave him a grateful nod before disappearing toward the back of the house. Drex, the sheriff called again. Yes, I'm in here with Holly. We're going to open the door. Holly, you're okay? I'm fine. We're both fine in here, she called out without leaving Drex's side. He would have preferred meeting the men without Holly there, but Sheriff Carpenter needed to know she was safe since her car was parked outside. Drex could only hope Zelinsky wouldn't try anything rash with the sheriff present. Still, he shifted his weight to feel the gun in his holster. Slowly, and with Holly tucked in by his side, he opened the door. The two men standing in the cold glared at him, Zelinsky looking surprisingly strung out, and Drex wondered if any of his haggard appearance was the result of a guilty conscience. "Zelinsky," he greeted him curtly without inviting him inside his house. "You look like you got run over by a reindeer. I would introduce Holly, but she tells me the two of you already met." The sheriff gave a slight arch to his eyebrow as he kept one hand on his gun handle. "You're burned, Alistair," Zelinsky spat. "You need to give up information the government paid to have delivered, the secrets you stole." Drex moved his body ever so slightly partially in front of Holly. He didn't like Zelinsky's bloodshot eyes and twitching left temple. He looked like a man on the edge. "Those secrets are safely in the hands of the CIA. Did you know they sent Spinner after me? Fortunately, I saved his life in Amsterdam. I left that tidbit out of my report, as it didn't seem relevant to the mission. I'm happy that piece of karma worked in my favor. With a little more good fortune, the CIA will find out who actually ordered the hit on Ludwig and worked to clear my name." Zelinsky's face contorted in a snarl as he reached for his weapon. A shot rang out. Chapter 11. Holly jolted at the sound of yet another gunshot. Even as it happened, Drex turned toward her and wrapped his arms around her. With her ears ringing, she frisked him. "You're okay. You're not shot." She couldn't see around Drex, but she could hear the other man screaming. "No, I'm fine. The sheriff shot Zelinsky in the hand." She held tight to Drex, but turned him slightly so she could see the sheriff. "Joe, you're okay?"
I'm fine, Holly. You stay inside. I'm going to call for an ambulance and Ned. Assuming he's managed to get out of the jail cell."
As the sheriff confiscated Zelinsky's abandoned gun on the porch, Drex let go of Holly long enough to fetch a towel from the kitchen and toss it to his former boss for his hand. The sheriff called in the incident. When he finished, Drex asked him, "How did you know I was innocent?"
Had a hunch. I didn't trust you at first. I got worried when Holly was growing attached, even though she's a good judge of character. Your coming clean in my office helped, albeit it seemed a bit far-fetched, until this unscrupulous gentleman made an appearance.
He cast a disparaging look at Zelinsky, who lay on the porch clutching his wrapped hand. Drex turned toward Holly. "I'm sorry I wasn't honest about who I was. I should have told you sooner." "I'm still processing it, but I'm glad you're okay." "I was terrified something bad was going to happen to you." When he buried his face in her hair by her neck, she startled. His expression of vulnerability rendered her momentarily speechless. "Did you mean what you said about this being your home?" she asked. He pulled back and looked down at her with a smile. "This house, this town, and you. It's all my home." 2 days later. "Lots of big events, Figgy." Holly paced her living room as she tugged at the sleeves of her sweater. "I'm seeing Drex tonight, and on Christmas Day, my family is driving down for a day visit." She had called her family the day after her brush with death, both getting shot at and jumping off her porch. She didn't tell her parents any of those events, but she did ask them over for Christmas lunch. To her surprise, they agreed to come and seemed genuinely excited about the invitation. It was past time for them all to reconcile. Her living room and kitchen were in decent enough shape for company, and the downstairs bathroom was functional now. She covered the bullet hole in her second-floor indoor balcony with twinkling garland, which she also looped over the front of the stairs so no guests would attempt to go up them and suffer injury. "Your life is an orderly shelf. You've no more need for this elf." She stopped and stared at him. "You're leaving?" Technically, she was supposed to have one more day before he vanished, but she suspected he meant goodbye for good, not just this Christmas. "To others I must gesture. This concludes our adventure." "I guess part of me suspected I couldn't have you forever. You've been wonderful. You helped a lot of people these last 3 Christmases, but mostly me. I'm grateful." "Your happiness is my reward. Pass the candle to a new steward." "I promise. Thank you for everything. I'll never forget you." With tears in her eyes, She watched Figgy McJingle's small form grow more translucent before disappearing altogether with one last jingle noise from his hat. Drex opened the door and let Holly in out of the cold. She took off her boots, hat, and coat in the entrance. He had cleaned his porch of all traces of the incident with his former boss. Merry Christmas. He leaned in and kissed her cheek. After the Zelinsky incident, he'd spent hours answering the sheriff's questions, followed by a debriefing with the CIA. He'd had to wait until today to see Holly, and he'd spent the time apart, unsure of what she thought of everything she'd learned about him. Merry Christmas. She beamed a smile at him that made him think a relationship with her could work. I made Cornish hens, stuffed bell peppers, and side salads. You've been busy. She followed him into the kitchen. And it smells amazing. Do you like wine? I have red or white. I have champagne, but I planned on saving that for when you come over for New Year's. Am I coming over for New Year's? A guy can hope. He pulled out the wine opener. I don't have any plans. I could be convinced. He turned toward her. What sort of convincing do you require? Well, I'm a hugger. So if we want to try this dating thing, I need a hug every time we see each other. He set down the wine opener, slid over to her, and wrapped his arms around her. I can definitely do that. I wanted to hold you in my arms the minute I opened the door, but I didn't want to be too forward, especially since I don't know how you feel about my past. She looked up at him, eyes dancing. It's definitely unconventional, and I get that there will be things you can't tell me and things I don't want to know. I've seen your true nature. Looking out for me, saving Stan's life, saving Molly's toddler. Your actions tell me you're one of the good guys, and you are going to be the most amazing travel guide. I have to bring you on all of my trips. He laughed. I can accommodate that, minus a few countries I should probably never go back to. Oh, and I think you should have one little section of your bookstore dedicated to spy novels, just for the irony. I like that. Oh, and you should have your own spy novel, The Spy Who Saved Christmas. Or maybe The Spy Who Loved Me. No, that one is taken. The Spy of Blitzen, which is funny since it sounds intense, but it actually takes place in small town Maryland. How about The Spy Who Found Christmas? I came to this town claiming I was making a fresh start when I intended to avoid people and entanglements like I always do. You changed that, Holly. Because of you, life has the potential to be better than I ever imagined. Maybe the title should be The Spy Who Kissed Holly. And maybe it's too soon to say something like this, but I'm falling in love with you. She arched up to him, and he met her with a kiss. The delightful connection was slow and sensual as it shattered all worried he'd harbored that his past would change how she felt about him. He didn't think he deserved this woman's affection, but he could spend every moment with her earning it. When the kiss ended, she whispered into his ear, "It's not too soon." The end.